Hey everyone, before we start with today's story, please comment down below where you live and what time it is right now. Thanks. Let's start. Christmas morning, 1929. Quiet snow on a farm in North Carolina. Hours later, neighbors find an unimaginable scene. 7 family members dead inside their home, their bodies arranged with eerie precision. How could a farmer, known as hardworking and prosperous, commit such a calculated act against his own wife and children? And why did he buy them new clothes and take them for a portrait just days before? This is no ordinary true crime case. It's a story that raises more questions the deeper you go. What secret was worth ending an entire family for? Imagine Christmas morning turning from calm to unthinkable horror. On December 25th, 1929, the Lawson family farm in Germantown, North Carolina, sat still beneath the pale winter sky. For most households in the surrounding community, the morning hours were filled with the familiar sounds of family gatherings, wood stoves rattling, children's laughter spilling onto porches, and the rustle of wrapping paper as gifts were shared. But on this particular farm, something was noticeably absent. The quiet was so heavy that neighbors arriving later would immediately sense the weight of it. It wasn't just silence. It was the kind of silence that unsettles, the kind that doesn't belong in a home where 8 people should have been together celebrating. The Lawson farm was no stranger to visitors. Relatives and neighbors often stopped by, especially during holidays. So when friends approached the property that day, nothing about the visit itself seemed unusual. Yet, as they drew closer, they could tell something was off. No one came out to the porch to greet them, no sense of cooking drifted from the chimney, and no movement stirred the yard where chickens usually scratched. It was the kind of stillness that prickles at instinct. People expected noise on Christmas, a home alive with excitement. Instead, the farm gave back nothing but an uncanny quiet, and the ordinary visit turned into a hesitant approach. The closer they stepped to the house, the stronger that sense of unease became. Even the animals seemed subdued, as if the natural rhythms of farm life had been interrupted. Neighbors paused, uncertain whether to knock at the door. It was not just a house that seemed empty, but a home that felt hollowed out. These were people they knew well: Charlie Lawson, his wife Fanny, and their children. But the silence pressing against the visitors made them hesitate, fearing what might be waiting on the other side of the thresholds they had crossed so many times before. Eventually, someone mustered the courage to enter. Inside, the stillness explained itself in the most jarring way possible. The interior should have been filled with the clamour of family, but instead, it carried the heavy air of death. What struck the neighbours immediately was not only that the family was gone, but the way in which the dead had been left. They found the children and their mother displayed as if arranged, not simply where they fell. Arms were folded across chests, and pillows had been placed beneath their heads. It looked deliberate, like someone had tried to give them a final rest, even after violence had stripped away the warmth of their lives. The image clashed deeply with the bloody reality. This was not the messy aftermath of sudden rage, not the chaotic disorder that often follows murders born of impulse. It was precise, ritual-like. Each body looked as though it had been positioned with intention. That cold and unnatural order only added to the terror of the sight, because it spoke of careful thought, a plan carried out step by step. To see children, a mother, a baby, all left like that sent chills far deeper than a random act of violence would have. For the neighbours, walking through those rooms was something they would never forget. The absence of sound outside now made perfect sense. The reason the farm was so still was chillingly clear. Nearly everyone inside had been killed. The details around the corpses suggested the killer had not only intended to wipe out his family, but had paused afterward to arrange them in a haunting display. Death had not been enough. He had chosen how they would be remembered in that space, at least until someone else entered to discover them. When word spread through the community, disbelief followed quickly. The Lawsons were known as a hard-working family. Their house should have been filled with generosity that morning, especially since Christmas meant so much in their small farming community. Instead, the grisly scene became something that neighbours would recount forever afterward. The idea that the killer had taken steps to arrange the bodies made it even harder to understand. For many, this detail was the most disturbing part of all, because it suggested calculation rather than impulse, a deliberate purpose instead of a sudden breaking point. Neighbours described the scene again and again once they left. They couldn't erase the image of the tiny baby, Mary Lou, or her older siblings. They couldn't explain why stones had been used as pillows for some of the younger children, or why arms were folded in such a formal fashion. The answers weren't there inside the bloody farmhouse, only haunting questions. The tableau made them feel as though the killer had intended to send a message, though no one could decipher what it meant. This wasn't just murder, it was a staged conclusion to a story no one outside the family yet understood. The quiet farm became, in those hours, a place of dread. People who had once come there for friendly visits now stood outside, whispering about what they had seen, not daring to step back into the rooms where the family lay. The shock of it spread, not just among the closest neighbours but across the town, then rippled outward into surrounding counties. But in those very first moments, before newspapers picked up the case, or ballads carried the tale further, it was simply neighbours standing in paralysis at a farmhouse saturated with loss. Details circulated quickly, the arms folded, the heads resting on makeshift pillows, even the sense that each detail meant more than it first appeared. Some thought the arrangement carried religious overtones. Others wondered if it was a twisted attempt to imitate peace. Whatever the reason, it was impossible to ignore that these acts had required time and composure. The killer hadn't fled. He hadn't hidden the crime in panic. Instead, he had chosen to leave the home as a horrifying stage set for whoever would walk through the door. That kind of careful, chilling preparation raised immediate questions about motive. This couldn't have been a random attack, or the work of someone who lost control in the heat of the moment. It seemed planned, even rehearsed in silence before being carried out. And if a man could carry out something so carefully within his own home, against his own family, then there had to be something deeper behind it, something more than frustration or economic troubles. To the neighbours, though, those deeper reasons were far beyond their grasp. All they could do was stand in that farmhouse and try to make sense of the unimaginable. The neighbours left with their stomachs unsettled and their minds restless. Inside, the home remained filled with the remainders of its final Christmas morning. Gifts abandoned, chairs in quiet disarray, a tree standing lifeless in the corner. But those signs of normal celebration had been swallowed up completely by the horror of death. The contrast made everything sharper, everything more haunting, because it wasn't just murder, it was murder dressed in the trappings of what should have been joy. The tableau of the 7 bodies raised questions immediately. Why cross their arms? Why place stones beneath their heads? Why turn Christmas Day into a scene designed to unsettle those who found it? Even in those first hours, the arrangement of the bodies suggested there was more to the crime than anyone could guess. The intentionality stood out as the first true mystery beneath the tragedy itself. To understand why the farmhouse became that chilling landscape, it is necessary to go back years earlier, long before Christmas morning, when the Lawson family was still building its life in Stokes County. A story of progress masks the seeds of disaster. Years before Christmas morning in 1929, the Lawson family lived what seemed like an ordinary rural existence. Charlie Lawson, his wife Fanny, and their children worked the fields like countless other families in Stokes County, North Carolina. Life as tenant farmers meant long days of labor, planting and harvesting for little more than a meager return. In the years just after World War I, farming in the South was punishing. Cotton had suffered from boll weevils, and tobacco was only steady work if the weather cooperated. Tenant families often moved season to season, following opportunities wherever they could find them. For many, ownership of their own farm felt almost unreachable, an ambition that most held onto even while knowing how slim their chances really were. The Lawsons, though, seemed to break that pattern. In 1927, Charlie bought land in Brook Cove, just outside Germantown. This shift, from tenant to landowner, was enormous. To have a farm under your own name meant security, and in a community where nearly every family laboured for someone else, it also meant respect. Neighbours began to see the Lawsons not as mere sharecroppers, but as what people at the time would call well-to-do farmers. The family was not wealthy by any measure, but owning land placed them a step above most, enough to be noticed by others in the area. On the surface, Charlie had achieved what so many around him wanted. He provided for a wife and 7 children, with the farm sustaining their daily lives. He was regarded as hard-working, the kind of farmer who made the most of any situation. For the family, this stage offered stability that the children had not always known in earlier years of tenancy. They now stayed in one place, settled in a home that belonged to them, and became part of a community where everyone recognized their growing success. At the same time, farming itself was never easy, and the late 1920s were a difficult span for small landowners. Economic pressures were already building, with crop prices fluctuating and whispers of larger troubles ahead. North Carolina farmers often relied on tobacco for income, though the labor that went into it was extensive and exhausting. Even landowners carried debts, especially after purchasing property. Charlie may have been regarded as fortunate, but that fortune came with heavy day-to-day burdens. Farming families shouldered constant risk, always one bad harvest away from losing what they had gained. To neighbours, though, the Lawsons were a symbol of steady progress. They worked together on the farm, and Charlie's ownership suggested that years of tenant farming had finally turned into something long-lasting. In small rural communities, social structures were tied to land, and having your own gave weight to your place among others. Reputation mattered, and the Lawsons were seen as respectable. They were not considered wealthy, but wealth was not the point. The achievement was stability. And for a man raising a large family, stability was everything. Yet this surface success sat alongside strains that few outsiders would have understood. Behind the image of prosperity lay personal hardships that had already touched the family deeply. In 1920, one of the Lawson children, a boy named William, had died. The death of a child in the early 20th century was sadly not uncommon, especially in rural areas without modern medical access. Still, the loss left a mark. Such tragedies left lasting shadows in families that often endured grief in silence, carrying it with them year after year while appearing to move on. That mix of progress and hardship defined the household during the years leading up to 1929. Conversations around them in the community would likely have focused on the family's good fortune. Yet inside the home, any number of unspoken pressures may have been present. A farm could provide stability, but maintaining it required relentless work. Children were raised with the expectation to contribute, and wives carried the weight of keeping homes running with few resources beyond what the land and livestock offered. Underneath appearances, stresses, emotional, physical, or financial, could quietly build without anyone beyond the house even suspecting. That is what made later events so confusing to those who knew them. From the outside, the Lawsons fit into a picture of respectable farming life. They had a farm they appeared to be managing, and there was nothing to suggest instability or danger. When the murders eventually came, that outward stability made the event incomprehensible for neighbours. They could not reconcile the farm-owning father, who had reached a measure of success, with the man capable of eliminating his whole family in a single morning. The story of the Lawson family shows how sometimes appearances in small, tight-knit communities can conceal private hardships. A man who seemed to embody rural prosperity had in fact laid the ground for tragedy, though no one recognized it at the time. The death of their child years earlier hinted that shadows already existed, although it was the normal practice for families of that time to continue forward without speaking openly of grief. Layers of expectation and silence made it difficult to see what truly existed behind the doors of rural homes. All of this history becomes important when considering how the family's life appeared just before 1929. They stood halfway between admiration from neighbours and the kind of isolation that comes when stresses are carried quietly inside. That combination, respect from the outside but private pressure on the inside, formed the backdrop for what would follow. By the holiday season of that year, the Lawson family seemed a model of progress. Their farm was working, their children appeared healthy, and their reputation looked solid. They were not struggling tenants anymore, they were owners. Even with the burdens that accompanied the farm, respectability shielded them in the eyes of the community. Nothing that December suggested an impending disaster. No visible sign pointed to the devastation only days away. That contrast is what preserves the puzzle of the Lawson murders to this day. How could a man move from milestones that his neighbours respected, tenant farmer, to landowner, to committing the most devastating crime imaginable against his own household? It is the contradiction between those two truths that keeps the case unforgettable. The apparent stability made what happened all the more shocking because, at least on the surface, Charlie Lawson had achieved what most men around him desired. But that success was thin, and whatever was happening behind the doors of the farmhouse would reveal itself in a way no one could have imagined. Neighbours remembered the family as thriving, and they truly had reason to believe it. The Lawsons' reputation was consistent with progress, with belonging, with a family that had made it. Local respect gave them a place in the community. Yet, days before Christmas, something shifted inside the household. What appeared as the stability of land ownership was replaced by actions that suggested planning, preparation, and an intention no one in Brook Cove could have ever predicted. On the surface, there was nothing to indicate the storm that was about to break. The illusion of normalcy held until only days before Christmas, when Charlie's decisions began to suggest otherwise. Why would a struggling farm family splurge on expensive clothes and a studio portrait? That question has haunted the Lawson murders from the very beginning. In the days before Christmas of 1929, Charlie Lawson, a man who had built a small farm through years of back-breaking labour, did something almost no one in his position would have considered. He took his entire family of 9, his wife, Fanny, and his 7 children, into town, where every one of them was fitted with brand new outfits. Then, Dressed in clothes that bore no resemblance to their usual farm attire, they went into a photography studio and posed together for a professional portrait. For people in their community, this outing appeared unusual from the start. Farm families of their class rarely had money left over for luxuries once debts, supplies, and daily needs were met. Clothing was bought only when necessary, often handed down from child to child until it no longer served its purpose. And a formal portrait was not a casual indulgence in 1929, it was expensive, reserved for weddings, funerals, or singular occasions in a family story. For the Lawsons to not only purchase new wardrobes but also commission a studio photograph suggested an event of deep significance, one that those who survived would never stop trying to interpret. That day in town has since become one of the most remembered moments of the Lawson story because it stood out sharply against the life they usually led. Neighbors and relatives would later say that Charlie's decision to buy the clothes, gather everyone together, and leave behind a posed image was strikingly unusual. Stories would circulate for decades, each turning over the same thought. Why that sudden and costly gesture, and why so close to the killings? One way of looking at it is pride. To have moved from tenant farming to land ownership was, in his world, an accomplishment. Capturing himself and his family in finer clothing, and freezing that moment on paper, may have felt like proof that he had achieved something worth remembering. This interpretation paints the photograph as a sort of victory image, a sign of how far they had come in just a few years. The children would look respectable, his wife would stand at his side, and Charlie himself would appear as a man of position. In that frame, he might have thought of it as leaving behind a record for relatives to hold, a visible statement of what he had built. Any family photograph might be explained that way, but the timing in this case has made it impossible to separate from what later happened. Within days of posing, the very people who stood stiffly in front of the camera were dead, their picture no longer a symbol of progress but a haunting reminder of what was about to be destroyed. The luxury of new clothes makes the picture even more unsettling, because they were worn only once, preserved permanently in black and white, and never again pulled from closets or drawers. For many studying the case afterward, the connection is too close to ignore. If Charlie Lawson had already decided to kill his family, then that photograph becomes something far darker. It could be seen as an intentional farewell, an image he wanted made while everyone was still alive, a picture that would outlast them. Instead of pride, it might have been resignation. Rather than marking success, it could have been his way of ensuring that the world remembered them in a carefully staged way. In that frame, their clothes were new, their appearances were polished, and the image was balanced, without the hardship of farm life etched into their faces. It was their final memory, not as they normally lived, but as he chose to present them. That is the shadow that follows the portrait to this day. Outsiders might regard it as a curious coincidence, but for those who saw its context, it carried weight. A decision like that from a man with little money to spare meant he had thought it through. He had judged it worth the cost. He had decided to freeze an image of the family right before he erased them. Photographs were permanent in a way life was not, and if he knew that permanence was about to matter, then premeditation becomes harder to dismiss. In remembering the case, people often return to that single photograph because it is the only surviving likeness of the entire family together. There are no home movies, no other records, just one still image, a family posed formally, unaware, or perhaps only partly aware, that it would serve as their last. Researchers and storytellers have lingered over expressions, trying to see hints of unease or reluctance in the faces of the children, or calm determination in Charlie's eyes. Whether those clues are really there can never be known, but speculation continues because the photograph carries with it both beauty and foreboding. The contrast is clear: a holiday approaching, a family in polished clothes, smiles faint or missing, all captured under the mechanical click of a camera. And beyond that, only days later, a crime so brutal that it shocked the county and spread across the nation. The juxtaposition is too tight to ignore. The portrait was no ordinary indulgence. It became the symbol of everything that was about to collapse. It is worth remembering how unusual such an expense truly was. In 1929, just months after the stock market collapse that began the Great Depression, ordinary families were already feeling uncertainty. Working-class farms suffered deeply when cash and credit dried up. That made splurging on non-essentials even less likely. Yet Charlie not only spent the money, he created a moment that assured permanence. Some argue that this makes the idea of simple pride or celebration less convincing. Spending in that way while practical concerns loomed only makes sense if he gave the money no future value, if he no longer cared about tomorrow, for himself or for anyone else. That observation has formed the foundation for one of the clearest arguments in favor of premeditation. The photograph, combined with the new wardrobes, was not simply a holiday indulgence. It was a sign of someone writing the last chapter of a story in advance. And that is why, even decades later, so many accounts of the Lawson case pause at this same detail. The photograph is not just a curiosity, but a piece of evidence in its own right, a realization that before the killings, Charlie Lawson had already closed the door on his family's future. Once seen in this light, the outing transforms completely. What others might see as a scene of family love begins to look like a stage set, arranged to appear perfect for one final image. The family stood close, newly clothed, frozen in their familiarity with one another, while to Charlie, it may have meant something darker. They would never again stand together like that. He would later arrange their bodies inside the house, but here in the photographer's studio, he arranged them for something more lasting. That decision remains one of the most unsettling questions in the whole case. Was it pride, farewell, or simply coincidence? No one can answer with certainty. But for many, the photograph serves as proof that the massacre was no sudden break, no impulse of a man who immediately lost control. Instead, it becomes the first visible clue that Charlie Lawson had already made his choice. That single trip into town and that single photograph, taken days before Christmas, would live on as the first unmistakable sign. It was as if he wanted to preserve them neatly once before destroying them chaotically, to leave behind an image while erasing their reality. And with that picture locked forever in time, Christmas morning soon revealed just how carefully he had prepared the next step of the plan. The violence did not start inside the Lawson farmhouse, but on a path near the tobacco barn. On Christmas morning, 16-year-old Carrie and her younger sister Maybelle, only 12, set out toward their aunt and uncle's home, expecting the same tradition they followed every year. They had no reason to believe the day would break from routine. Their father, though, had already laid out the beginning of a sequence in his mind. Instead of being inside with his wife and other children, Charlie waited outside with his shotgun. He placed himself where he knew the girls would walk, as if he was not just letting the day play out, but following a plan he had fixed long before that morning arrived. The sisters carried themselves along the familiar path, as they had done countless times, but their father was already waiting for them, with a weapon ready. There was nothing casual or momentary about it. He was hiding with the intent to strike, and when the girls passed, he released the first act of the massacre. A single shotgun blast hit the girls, yet he did not leave their fate to chance. After using the firearm, he moved closer and used blunt force to make certain neither survived. It was calculated. It showed not just the will to kill, but the certainty that he wanted no possibility of life afterward. That method, shooting and then striking, meant more than simple violence. It spoke to an insistence that what he started would be finished completely. Charlie was thorough, even in brutality, and to those who later studied the killings, it marked him as someone steady in his movements, rather than overcome by temporary rage. Once he had made sure the two girls were gone, he lifted their bodies from along the path and carried them into the barn. Rather than leaving them exposed where others might stumble upon them, he moved them out of sight, tucked away in a building that held the tools and leaves of everyday farm labor. Placing them there showed another layer of carefulness. Most crimes that erupt in sudden anger leave bodies where they fall. Here, though, Charlie took time to disturb the order of the morning further by removing them. Neighbors believed later that this was proof of premeditation. He had not simply lashed out and then panicked. He shot, he struck, and then he concealed. He controlled not just their lives, but how and when others would find them. His choices gave him both time and a pathway to move next inside the farmhouse, without immediate alarm being raised. This ambush also broke from what should have been the most ordinary kind of holiday. The family was expected to join relatives, arriving with children in hand, gifts in small packages, and stories to share as meals were put on the table. That was the pattern, an unbroken tradition that bound communities together. Instead of allowing his daughters to take part in it, Charlie replaced that tradition with an attack. It severed the holiday and replaced it with something no neighbor or family member could have imagined. Christmas visits that should have ended in small talk and food now ended in the concealment of two children's bodies inside a barn. The act of waiting by the barn carried its own weight. To position himself beforehand meant he had planned the attack in advance, and by choosing his daughters, he did not begin with himself, nor even with his wife, but rather with the children least able to resist or defend themselves. It was not an explosive decision made within seconds. It was a quiet wait for the moment they would walk into the range of his weapon. This shows a disturbing awareness. Every detail of their routine played into his control of the moment. For Carrie and Maybelle, the morning should have been one of simple purpose. crossing to their aunt's house together, likely expecting food and family warmth at the end. For Charlie, their path was nothing but a step in the sequence he intended to carry out. He reduced their innocent activity, meant to bind family traditions, to a target passing through his line of sight. Once those first gunshots rang out among the buildings, the progression of killings had begun, and there was no turning it back to the morning it should have been. The care he took in hiding them in the barn signaled something chilling. As though he had the need to preserve order even in the middle of disorder, he chose not to leave his daughters where others could stumble across them too quickly. He wanted the control to unfold at his pace. Moving them also shielded the farmhouse momentarily from attention. With the bodies removed, he could then proceed to the next part of his plan. If neighbors had stumbled across dead children on that path, the chain of acts might have stopped short. By dragging them into the barn, he made sure no one else knew yet. There was a disturbing symmetry in this act. In the days beforehand, he had positioned his family for a portrait, controlling how they appeared in front of a camera. Now, in violence, he was positioning them again, even in death, to match the way he dictated their story. Taking them into the barn was, in a sense, more of that control, choosing how they would be revealed, rather than letting chance dictate the discovery. Each step of that morning was layered with intention. Shooting, striking, moving. None of these belonged to a man suddenly lost in blinding rage. They belonged to a sequence mapped beforehand, remembered in silence by someone who planned out the hours to come. Starting outdoors, away from the farmhouse, gave him the chance to isolate the first victims and eliminate their presence before turning toward the rest of the family. The tradition of visiting relatives never happened that morning. Instead, the ambush of two daughters became the marker of a holiday turned into horror. The normal rhythm of December, filled with family walking hand in hand across short distances to celebrate together, was interrupted by the weight of murder. In a county where those Christmas gatherings were a central part of community bonds, people would later reflect on how impossible it felt to trace Charlie's line of thought. The season represented care and kin, but his action began with betrayal of both. So the murders began not inside the heart of the family home, but just beside it, under the cold sky, along the path to relatives' company. From the simple walk of two young girls, the day turned into its violent course. Those first killings of Carrie and Maybelle framed everything that followed. At that point, there was no longer any confusion about intention. It was not an accident. It was not a collapse over a single argument. It had started with steps meant to ensure that none of his family would survive the day. The ambush of his daughters marked the beginning of a chain that was carried out step by step, each moment arranged to build toward completion. They were not left where they had fallen. They were staged and stored, cut from Christmas life, taken from the safety they should have had. And from that beginning, Charlie Lawson carried his weapon back across his yard. He returned toward the porch where his wife stood, ready for the next part of the plan. The farmhouse, the heart of family life, became a place of slaughter. After killing Carrie and Maybelle near the tobacco barn, Charlie Lawson walked back toward the home. On the porch stood his wife, Fanny, carrying out the rhythm of the morning as though it were any other Christmas day. Charlie raised his shotgun and fired. The blast dropped her instantly in front of the door she had opened and closed countless times before, the very space where her children would normally gather around her for warmth and comfort. The shot echoed through the house, jolting the family still inside. Marie, the oldest daughter still living at home, reacted first. Her scream carried across the wooden walls, signaling terror before she was able to move. For James and Raymond, the younger boys, there was nothing to do but hide. In a moment, the farmhouse was transformed. Where safety should have existed, only panic remained. For those inside, there was no chance to think clearly, for the danger came not from outside but from their own father. Charlie entered after killing Fanny. He found Marie in the main room. She was only 17, standing in shock as her brothers scattered. In the sequence he had begun, there was no pause for care. He raised the gun again. A shot killed her, ending her screams, and with her fell another piece of the household that had been alive only minutes earlier. With Fanny gone and Marie dead, the house became quieter, save for the movements of two boys scrambling to find refuge from the man they had always depended on. James and Raymond had sought places to escape. One hid behind furniture, while the other pressed himself against whatever might shield him from sight. Their attempts could not stand against Charlie's determination. He moved through the rooms in search of them, weapon in hand, not rushing but steady, with the certainty of someone finishing a task already planned. Each boy fell in turn as he tracked them down. At that point, the farmhouse became stained with fear as much as with blood. The rooms that had watched over years of lives and labour bore witness to their end. Only one remained after the older children. Mary Lou, the youngest, still an infant. She had been born less than a year before, still at the stage where every day was filled with care and dependency. For Charlie, she was not spared. Instead of the shotgun, it was blunt force that ended her life. She was struck and killed through direct violence, the smallest and most defenseless one taken last. The fact that even she, not yet able to walk or talk, was included in the killings underscored that none were exempt. The methodical pattern continued in the house, just as it had by the barn. Each family member was targeted one by one, worked into the sequence in a way that showed no sign of second thoughts. This was not random, not a crime unfolding from a sudden spark of anger. It was controlled, careful, and unbroken until every member who remained within the home was killed. By the time silence finally settled back over the farmhouse, 7 members had already perished at his hands on Christmas morning. What makes this portion of the case endure in memory is the contrast. Christmas Day in a rural North Carolina community was filled with traditions. Families leaving farms briefly to visit relatives, opening small gifts that had been tucked away for weeks, children carrying laughter out into yards. That same morning in the Lawson home was marked instead by a father carrying out the erasure of his entire family. The joy attached to the season was replaced by horror, and each room that should have heard voices of excitement became instead the scene of systematic killings. Neighbors who would later arrive managed to see the remnants of that switch. A decorated tree still stood in the house, farm tools remained where they had been left, and signs of daily life were unchanged in many ways. But lying among those signs of celebration were the bodies of those who should have been gathered around the same tree. In that home, the material evidence of ordinary life was overlaid with the evidence of death. No one who described the scene afterward failed to mention how disturbing that contrast felt. Each victim inside showed the same treatment Charlie had used elsewhere, arranged after death. Arms were folded, heads placed upon makeshift supports. It meant that not only had he killed them, he had lingered. He took time to position them after silence had fallen, converting the house into a kind of stage. This deliberate arrangement turned the home from a place of family into a kind of unnatural tableau, a frozen image of death imposed by its own father. Such attention to detail raised larger questions from the beginning. What would drive a man not only to end the lives of those closest to him, but to do so in such orderly fashion? The pattern made it difficult to interpret the murders as uncontrolled rage. Rage burns fast and disorganized. This, by contrast, was prolonged, methodical, and exact. Every person who should have been his responsibility was eliminated, with no signs of hesitation other than the time he took to move between victims. This level of control left townspeople unnerved. The kind of stability Charlie had shown in public life clashed with the behavior inside the house that morning. He was not simply lashing out at a single family member. He was completing something like an erasure, moving through each child and his wife, until none remained. Christmas Day had been scheduled to become the day of the family's destruction, and the quiet order of the killings suggested he had accepted that decision before the morning even began. The farmhouse had always been the heart of the Lawson family's life, the safe place after work in the fields, the shelter against cold weather, the site of meals and rest. That heart, on Christmas morning, beat for the last time under the violence that removed every one of its occupants. By the end of the sequence, what was left inside was stillness, with 7 people dead and none alive to speak for themselves. Outside of that farmhouse, though, one person remained absent. Among the 9 members of Charlie's household, one had not been caught within those walls during the killings. His eldest son, Arthur, was not at home when the gunshots sounded and the cries were silenced. That fact alone meant that when the morning ended, the killings were not the total erasure Charlie may have intended. One child survived by having been sent away, and his survival introduced the next question in the story. Why had Charlie spared only him? The eldest son lived because his father sent him away. On the morning of December 25th, 1929, while his siblings stayed behind at the farm, 19-year-old Arthur Lawson was instructed by his father to leave the property. The errand he was sent on was never fully detailed, but its effect was immediate. While the rest of the children and their mother faced what was waiting inside the farmhouse, Arthur was spared. He returned later that day to a home that no longer resembled the one he had left. Arthur's absence from the farm that morning has remained one of the most debated aspects of the case. Charlie Lawson had carried out the killings of his wife, his daughters, his younger sons, and even the infant Mary Lou. Yet Arthur was told to be away. That single decision kept him alive. The question of why has lingered ever since. Some wondered if Charlie had planned to keep at least one son from the beginning. Others suggested that Charlie saw Arthur as too old and strong to be taken by surprise like the younger children. Either way, sending him out changed the way the story unfolded. When Arthur returned, the family farm was no longer familiar. The stillness on the property hid nothing of what had taken place, and the neighbours and law enforcement had already started to gather. He was not met by an ordinary holiday, but by investigators surrounding the house, the barn, and the yard. Inside, the bodies of his mother, his sisters, his brothers, and the baby had already been discovered. Arthur's survival meant he did not just lose his family, but that he lived on as the sole witness to the aftermath. Speculation rose quickly about the reason for his absence. One theory has continued to reappear, that Charlie spared him because Arthur had grown into a man, tall and physically capable. Unlike the younger boys, Arthur worked the fields as his father's equal. If Charlie had attempted to take him by surprise, Arthur could have fought back. That possibility may have been enough to make Charlie avoid conflict with him altogether. This interpretation views Arthur's survival as practical, not sentimental. It was easier to send him away than to risk a struggle. Another theory takes a different angle. Some insist that Charlie wanted a witness, someone alive to carry forward what had happened. By keeping Arthur away, Charlie ensured that the killings would be discovered not just by neighbours or police, but by his own son on his return. If true, that decision added another layer of intention to an already deliberate crime. Arthur would not only survive, but also bear the knowledge of what his father had done, living out the rest of his life with that shadow. No evidence has ever confirmed either theory. What remains clear is that Arthur's fate set him apart. He was the only member of the household who escaped both the violence and the arrangement of their bodies that followed. As the eldest, the burden of survival fell on him before he had any chance to refuse it. His name came to the front of every report, and his life after that day was shaped by the fact that he alone had been left behind. Arthur's survival meant he had to witness the consequences almost immediately. While others speculated from a distance, he walked into the stillness of his family's home, greeted not by his mother's cooking or his siblings' voices, but by an investigation that was already underway. The picture he met was irreversible. Surviving that moment did not make him free of it, but bound him to it for the rest of his life. Every article written about the case, every discussion among neighbours, and every retelling in the years to come mentioned Arthur because he was the only direct link left. After the murders, Arthur tried to maintain his life as others in the region carried on with farm work. But repeating daily routines was not the same with the memory of that day attached. The killings became a permanent shadow in public and private. Wherever he went, he carried the identity of being the son who lived. In a small community, that title never disappeared, and beyond the county, it followed him into history. In later years, Arthur married and started a family of his own. The tragedy did not prevent the continuation of the Lawson name, and descendants from his line still connected the story of survival to themselves. Yet it was survival born of separation, one choice made by his father on that morning. That survival contained both luck and cruelty. Luck that he was told to leave, and cruelty that he had to return to face the wreckage left behind. Arthur's life lasted only until 1945, when he died in a motor accident at the age of 35. His early death came less than 2 decades after the murders. The accident added another layer of grief to a family already marked by tragedy. Those who knew him could not miss the fact that he was taken young, like so many others in his family, though by different means. Unlike his siblings, however, Arthur left children, and those children later carried a sense of continuation rather than finality. Through Arthur's descendants, the family's link to the murders continued into the present. Every new generation connected back to him, the one Lawson who had not been at the house when the massacre took place. For his children and grandchildren, survival was based on that single errand and that single absence on Christmas morning. Family stories could not avoid the subject because Arthur's life and death were already tied to it by history. The fact that he lived has given the case one of its most enduring mysteries. It is not simply that one son survived, but that he survived by design. Charlie Lawson told him to leave. That instruction cannot be erased from the story, and it leaves space for both chance and intention. If Charlie feared him, then Arthur lived because of strength. If Charlie wanted a witness, then Arthur lived because of weakness. Either way, Arthur became central in ways he never asked to be. His name appears again and again because it represents what was lost and what remained. While the others passed into memory as victims, he endured in the living record of the case. The suspicion around his survival has not faded. It follows behind every discussion of motive, every theory raised about why the killings took place, and every attempt to explain what kind of man Charlie Lawson truly was. Arthur Lawson's survival cannot be reduced to clear reasons. It was both chance and mystery, an outcome shaped by one command on Christmas morning that altered his entire course of life. More than 90 years later, that decision still stands as one of the most challenging puzzles in the story. He lived while others did not, and the shadow of that fact set him apart in a way that no one else could share. As the hours passed that day, and neighbors examined the farmhouse, Charlie Lawson walked away into the nearby woods. The killings had ended, and one more loud report of a shotgun was soon to be heard through the quiet trees. Hours after the killings, a single gunshot echoed through the trees. The sound carried across the Lawson farm and was heard by neighbors and searchers who had gathered around the property. They knew instantly what it meant. By then, the community was reeling from the discovery of 7 dead family members inside the farmhouse. The blast from the woods marked the final act. Charles Lawson had walked away from the home he had destroyed, carrying his weapon, and ended his life among the trees. Charlie's path into the woods was not random. He left behind a scene that would remain one of the most shocking in North Carolina's memory, and retreated inward, away from the noise of neighbors and law enforcement gathering near the farmhouse. While the bodies of his wife and children lay inside, he took deliberate steps into the woods that bordered his land. Those footsteps carried him to a single tree, where evidence would later show he stopped, turned, and walked again and again around the same spot, before finally using his shotgun on himself. When people rushed toward the direction of the gunshot, they found him lying near that tree. The footprints told part of the story. They were not in straight lines leading up to the body. They circled again and again, pressing the soft ground into a clear pattern that showed hesitation. Charlie had not fired on himself as soon as he entered the woods. He had paced. He had walked in circles, as though wrestling with the decision, building the courage, or struggling against the urge to turn back. His killer's composure inside the home was followed by uncertainty as he faced his own ending. Close to where he fell, searchers discovered another unsettling detail. Alongside his body sat notes addressed to his parents. The existence of these notes signaled that his actions were not only physical, but also carried the weight of intention to communicate with his family beyond death. While the words themselves are not preserved in public record, their presence pointed toward an attempt to leave explanation, or apology, or perhaps confession. The unanswered contents of those notes became part of the mystery, leaving people to wonder what truth they might have revealed about motive. The image painted by the footprints and the notes is striking. Inside the farmhouse, his decisions had been carried out in a steady line of violence, each step without pause. Outside, when the time came to face himself, indecision appeared. He delayed. He walked around the tree several times. Then, finally, the gunshot cut the tension, ending the story of the man who had ended his family. In that final moment, silence returned to the woods. For the neighbors waiting near the farm, silence had already been tied to horror, and now it carried another weight. It confirmed that the man responsible was gone. The community's reaction to his death was complicated. Relief was one response. With Charlie Lawson's suicide, there was no longer any possibility of him continuing to harm others, no need for a manhunt, no chance of him walking freely after what he had done. At the same time, many felt immediate frustration. Suicide removed the chance for questioning. No courtroom would ever hear him speak his reasons. No investigators would ever obtain his testimony. With Charlie's death, answers disappeared at the very moment questions were multiplying. For Arthur, returning to the farm and seeing his father's body brought another level of weight. While others tried to comprehend from a distance, Arthur was thrust into the center of every development that day. He had discovered the bloody aftermath at the farmhouse, and only hours later, he stood among neighbors and police, looking at his father's lifeless body in the woods. His survival had already been set apart, and now he also carried the image of his father's self-inflicted death. The errand that sent him away earlier that morning had spared him, only to return him to brutal scenes no son should ever endure. Neighbors, officials, and reporters, arriving soon after, noted every detail available. They described the footprints as evidence of hesitation. They pointed out the notes, lingering on what they might mean. People sensed that those small pieces of evidence offered clues that could have helped explain why the killings had happened at all. But with no words beyond the fact that the letters existed, speculation became the only tool. Rumors took hold. Communities filled in the absence of explanation with guesses, theories, and stories that grew over time. The suicide in the woods closed the physical acts of the massacre, but it did not close the case. In fact, it only launched more questions. The pacing around the tree left the impression that Charlie had struggled for minutes, perhaps longer, with the final shot. Did that mean he regretted his actions? Did it mean he tried to delay his own death in hopes of reconsidering? Or was he waiting for the moment to feel right to him? These questions stuck because they were unanswerable. connected to a final moment, lived only by Charlie himself. By late afternoon that Christmas day, both the farmhouse and the wooded patch had become sites of tragedy. On one side stood the arranged bodies of his wife and children, frozen in their unnatural rest. On the other lay the body of the man responsible, surrounded by the marks of his pacing. The contrast was clear. The family he destroyed had been arranged in death by his control, but his own final act carried the appearance of hesitation and uncertainty. He had lingered and circled before ending himself. The effect on the wider community spread immediately. Word of the massacre had already begun to travel fast, but with Charlie's suicide, the story now had both beginning and end within one day. Relief that the killer was gone, combined with bewilderment that no trial, no admission, and no reasoning would ever come. The cemetery in the woods became the closest thing to answers. People could walk the ground and see the footprints in the mud, but they could not read his mind. The unanswered purpose remained locked in silence. The conclusion of Charlie Lawson's life inside the woods seemed to finish the event to some, a final gunshot, sealing the day. But to most who knew the family or heard the story afterward, the suicide complicated everything. It left the community holding fragments of information, the arrangement of bodies, the footprints around a tree, the undetailed notes to his parents, without a completed picture of motive. With nothing more than evidence of deliberation but no words to explain it, the narrative was left open. So on Christmas Day, the chaos of a massacre had closed with a single gunshot. The killer was dead, lying among marks that spoke of hesitation but not of confession. What remained were questions. Why had he erased his family? Why had Arthur been spared? Why did he pace before turning the weapon on himself? These puzzles brought the community no closer to understanding, and soon enough, the emptiness left by his silence gave space for rumors to spread. Even Charlie's gunshot did not bring an ending, because from the moment he fell in the woods, the story stopped belonging only to what had been seen. It moved instead into theories, whispers, and explanations that reached far beyond the Lawson farm. Even death did not close the case. Rumors and theories took over. Could a head injury explain the massacre? In the months before Christmas Day of 1929, people around Germantown began to notice something odd about Charles Lawson. He had suffered an accident that left him with a blow to the head. Accounts described it as a fall, or strike hard enough to concern his family, and, soon after, neighbours began whispering that the man did not seem entirely the same. To a community searching for reasons behind the unimaginable, this incident quickly became a starting point. If a sudden change in behaviour could be traced back to a physical injury, it offered the kind of explanation people were desperate to believe. At the time, head injuries, even those not clearly visible on the surface, were suspected of altering moods, judgment, or personality. People in Stokes County recalled the blow and tied it directly to what would later happen in the farmhouse. Families whispered in kitchens, and men standing in tobacco barns compared what they had seen before and after the accident. Was his temper sharper? Did he act distracted? Many insisted they sensed a difference, though no one could point to a clear example. The rumour solidified after the murders, when the entire community searched for something tangible to blame. The problem, though, was evidence. Rumour carried weight in small towns, but officials knew that anecdotes were not enough. So, after Charlie's death, attention turned to his body. If he had changed in the months before the killings, science might confirm it. Medical researchers at Johns Hopkins Hospital were asked to study his brain directly after the autopsy. The hope was that pathology would show scars, bleeding, or other lasting damage. If abnormalities could be found, they might provide a concrete reason for why a stable farmer would destroy his entire family. When the results returned, however, the findings collapsed the theory. According to the autopsy and the review at Johns Hopkins, there were no abnormalities noted in Charles Lawson's brain. No evidence of trauma showed up. No tumours, no fractures inside the skull, no lesions suggesting hidden damage. The structures of his brain appeared as expected for a man of his age. For investigators, this ruled out the neat medical explanation many had expected. This result frustrated those still reeling from the nightmare. Without proof of injury, what could possibly account for it? Medical science provided nothing to anchor the violence. For a farming community that wanted cause and effect, the absence of evidence kept people in uncertainty. Instead of erasing the rumour, the clean results only forced speculation into two directions. Either the injury had been real and left effects not visible through medical means available at the time, or the problem lay deeper, inside his thoughts and choices, not inside his skull. Both explanations carried problems. If the injury mattered, why had no damage been found? If psychology explained it, What sign had pointed to building disturbance before that December? Neither option satisfied grieving families or stunned neighbours. And in a time when talk of mental illness held stigma, many preferred to think of a farmer changed suddenly by a strike to the head, rather than admit deeper troubles could sit undetected in any household. Simpler reasoning felt easier. It was more comfortable to say, an accident caused him to change, than to admit he might have lived with hidden despair, anger, or dysfunction for years. Despite the official statement that nothing abnormal existed in the brain tissue, the rumour stuck. People repeated it in grocery stores, on porches, and in church pews. The blow to the head gave them something graspable, a single moment where fate turned. For them, science might say the accident led nowhere, but faith in storylines where one event explains tragedy was stronger. People want single causes to help them carry on. So in the years after 1929, talk of a head injury continued to be passed down, even when it did not stand on confirmed evidence. Medical science at the time had its own limits, which encouraged the persistence of rumour. The ability to study microscopic changes inside the brain was not as advanced as modern methods. So skeptics argued that something subtle might have been missed. Even if doctors declared the brain normal, the idea that unseen changes occurred let the community retain belief in the head injury explanation. It kept space open for doubt, and in that space, rumour thrived. As investigators and later researchers tried to understand Charlie Lawson, this failure of science to align with local stories became one of the sticking points. The autopsy provided a blank conclusion, while neighbours preferred a narrative with cause. This split mirrored a larger puzzle about the massacre. The brutality demanded a reason, but nothing in available science or psychology gave a full answer. People revolved around possible explanations, trying to ease the weight of living alongside such an incomprehensible act. In conversations years later, oral histories preserved how the injury theory stayed alive. Older residents recalled that he had taken a knock on the head and became different. Even when they admitted doctors had called his brain normal, they returned to their own testimonies. They remembered him distracted, moody, or withdrawn in ways they thought linked back directly to the accident. In their minds, it was impossible that the man they once saw smiling in church pews had simply turned violent without outside cause. So the legend of the head injury endured in parallel with the scientific record. Comparisons circulated too. Some pointed to war veterans who returned with head wounds and were not the same men afterward. Others mentioned neighbours who had suffered concussions and shown changes. These parallels allowed the rumour to continue, giving people relatable examples even if none were medically tied to Charlie. The narrative matched common experiences, which allowed it to spread far easier than the official autopsy. But by the time scholars and writers revisited the case decades later, the limits of this explanation became more clear. The brain report stood, unchanged. The community's reliance on rumour versus scientific evidence highlighted how desperate people were for reasons. In the end, the head injury did not carry sufficient proof, and researchers turned towards psychological and social aspects of his life for answers. Scrutiny shifted away from blows to the skull and toward personal dynamics inside the farmhouse, where stresses and secrets may have built unnoticed. Yet even as other theories emerged, the story of the head injury never fully disappeared. It faded from serious analysis, but as local lore, it remained. When neighbours and later generations explained the massacre, they still sometimes pointed to the accident. It changed him, they would say, repeating what their parents or grandparents had once concluded. Science removed the explanation, but rumour preserved it. This shows how enduring need for cause outweighs uncomfortable admissions of mystery. The Lawson murders could not simply be filed away as random. Communities need causes, even imperfect ones, to close stories. The head injury gave them such a cause, even while being contradicted. It faded from investigations but never left memory. Still, with no physical evidence supporting the claim and no clarity in his autopsy, the accident could never stand alone as the final answer. In time, another story grew stronger than the head injury theory. This was a tale not about an outside accident, but about hidden complications within the family itself. Another, darker rumour soon overshadowed the injury explanation. The most controversial theory involves incest and pregnancy. More than 60 years after the murders, the story took on another layer when it was written about in a 1990 book called White Christmas, Bloody Christmas. The account claimed that 17-year-old Marie Lawson had become pregnant by her father, Charlie. If true, this would not only reshape the understanding of the murders, but also explain a potential motive that had gone unspoken for decades. The idea struck readers and the community with force because it was a secret darker than anyone had imagined. The book's detail did not stand alone. According to the account, The claim did not simply arise from an outsider's opinion. Family gossip, overheard conversations, and private words passed between friends began to surface. Stella Lawson, a relative, said that before the killings, she heard family members discussing Fanny's unease about an incestuous relationship between Charlie and Marie. This meant that suspicion was not limited to the hindsight of rumour after the crime had occurred, but existed in hushed tones even before that Christmas day. To add weight, another voice joined the record years later, through a story passed on by one of Marie's closest friends. In 2006, another book titled The Meaning of Our Tears expanded the same theory. In it, a woman named Ella May, who had been close to Marie before the murders, stated that Marie confided in her that she had become pregnant by her father. According to this account, both her parents knew, and in the final weeks of 1929, the family carried the secret inside the walls of the farmhouse. If this statement is accurate, then Charlie Lawson would have been aware not only of the act of incest but of its consequence. And so, when Christmas arrived, he carried more than the role of farmer and father. He carried the possibility of exposure, disgrace, and consequences no community at the time would have overlooked. What makes this theory hold power is not only the content, but the timing. If in fact Marie had told a friend weeks before her death, it suggests an immediacy that makes sense of the otherwise unexplainable slaughter. In a small community built around reputation, any proof of incest could ruin a family entirely. Gossip, once confirmed, would not be sealed back inside the farmhouse. If neighbours began to suspect, the family's position in Brook Cove would collapse overnight. For a man obsessed with control of his land, control of his image, and even control of how the bodies were left, exposure may have been seen as unbearable. At the same time, the theory has its flaws. There are no medical records showing that Marie was pregnant in December 1929. No physical evidence surfaced during the autopsies that confirmed any of the claims. No contemporary newspaper articles or investigators of the time recorded incest as a suspected motive. The entire story rests on oral accounts, handed down privately for decades, then put in print late in the 20th century. For many researchers, this gap is critical. Without physical proof, the incest theory can never move beyond speculation, even if it seems plausible to those who know the dynamics of family secrecy. This contrast between rumour and documented fact makes the Lawson case so difficult to pin down. On one side stands official history. A farmer murdered 7 members of his family before taking his own life, with no clear explanation. On the other side stand decades of local stories that push beyond what the record says. The incest theory emerged from the second side, rooted in gossip, memory, and community whispers. For people who believe it, the killings become easier to understand. They are no longer the random violence of a farmer, but the desperate erasure of a secret about to be revealed. Marie stands at the center of the theory, not only because she was the daughter, but because she symbolized both innocence and betrayal. As the supposed victim of incest, Marie becomes a tragic figure silenced before she could break away. As the potential mother of her father's child, she becomes the reason behind an entire family's eradication. In either version, her role shifts the way the murders are seen. Instead of being one of many killed, she becomes the key to why they were all killed. For members of the community in later years, this theory also worked as a way of explaining the magnitude of the event. Without it, the killings seemed unconnected to motive. With the incest story, the tragedy gained a cause as shocking as the act itself. A father desperate to keep his crime hidden killed not only the daughter who might reveal him, but the entire family that stood around her. By arranging their bodies so carefully, he could have been staging order where in truth there had been dysfunction. Still, skepticism remains strong among historians and local researchers. They point out that the theory emerged far too late to be tested. The only direct claims arrived in the 1990s and 2006, long after every witness and investigator of the original period had passed away. That distance in time leaves the claims vulnerable to memory's weaknesses, to exaggeration, and to the blending of rumour into accepted truth. Without hard evidence, the incest theory will always be shadowed by uncertainty. And yet, regardless of whether it is true or not, the theory has become permanently attached to the Lawson case. Any modern retelling includes it. People revisit the same words: overheard conversation, confided secret pregnancy. The book titles themselves ensured the idea spread widely, far beyond Germantown and Stokes County. Music, articles, and podcasts picked it up as the most haunting layer of the tragedy. For many outside researchers, it gave the story longevity precisely because it pointed to dark secrets hidden within family life, secrets that proved as powerful as crime itself. Consider the pattern. Charlie gave his family new clothes, took them to sit for a portrait, and then, days later, destroyed them. If at the center of that sequence stood his fear that Marie might bring his abuse into the open, then the portrait itself also takes on a different meaning. It could have been less about pride and more about capture, a family forced into one image before their shared silence broke apart. Arranging the bodies after death could also be read differently, not as ritual alone, but as control over a story before anyone else could tell it. While historians emphasize that no physical confirmation exists, the incest theory has nevertheless overtaken the head injury story, financial theories, or the idea of sudden break. It frames the murders not as senseless, but as deliberate protection of a secret, and it changes how the family itself is seen. Less the victims of sudden rage, more the victims of years of silence, control, and abuse that culminated in their elimination. The power of the theory lies in its ability to explain motive where none had been agreed upon. Whether or not it can ever be proved, the incest narrative has cemented itself within the legacy of the Lawson murders. What might have remained a story of brutality became a story of hidden family secrets. It is that mixture of murder and suppressed scandal that ensures the case is remembered not only for its horror but its mystery. Even today, the controversy divides people. Some accept it as the most likely truth, while others reject it as harmful rumor. But its effect is beyond question. By attaching the idea of incest and pregnancy to the Lawson story, the murders transformed from crime into legend. They carry not only grief but suspicion, not only facts but folklore. And once that layer was added, the farmhouse itself gained a different life, not just as a site of violence, but as a stage for storytelling that people would travel to see. The Lawson farmhouse became a macabre tourist attraction. Within weeks of the murders, Charlie's brother, Marion Lawson, began opening the family home to the public. For a small fee, curious visitors could walk through the rooms where the killings happened. The house on Brook Cove Road, meant to be a farm residence, became a destination. Instead of being remembered only as the site of one family's Christmas holiday, it turned into a space people paid to enter, where grief turned into something to be examined. Marion's choice reflected what often happens after highly publicized crimes. Communities and travelers wanted to see with their own eyes the space that newspapers had described in such detail. It was not enough to imagine. They wished to step inside and look directly at the rooms where 7 lives had ended. The Lawson home became a kind of stage. Chairs, tables, and decoration were no longer family property, but objects of morbid interest. Every piece connected to the Lawsons became part of the attraction. Among the most striking details preserved inside was Marie Lawson's unfinished Christmas cake. It had been baked before the holiday as part of the family's celebration. After the murders, it remained on display in the kitchen. Unlike furniture or walls stained by death, the cake stood out as a normal object of family joy suddenly halted. As visitors came through the house, the cake became one of the main points of attention. Its incompletion felt symbolic, like a pause in family life that could never resume. The cake carried weight because of what visitors did with it. In the earliest months that Marion opened the house, people began removing raisins from the cake. They treated these small pieces not as food, but as souvenirs. Removing raisins from a dead girl's holiday treat became their way of carrying part of the tragedy home. This behavior alarmed the family, and the cake was placed under a glass cover to protect what remained. Even then, it stayed on display for those who entered, its preservation continuing the lure of seeing something so ordinary forever linked to something so violent. This transformation marked a shift that would continue for decades. What had been a private home became part of cultural fascination. People outside Germantown who had never known the Lawson family came to witness the remnants. Objects lost their original purpose and became relics. A cake intended for a meal turned into an artifact. The attraction drew lines between private tragedy and public spectacle that blurred until the house itself seemed no longer to belong to the name Lawson, but to the larger collective of visitors who passed through. It was not only the house and its objects that expanded the reach of the case. In 1930, only a year after the massacre, the story was put into song. A group called the Carolina Buddies recorded a ballad titled "The Murder of the Lawson Family" for Columbia Records. The tune followed the long tradition of murder ballads in American folk culture, adding rhythm and verse to events that shocked communities. For rural audiences who may not have read much of the news coverage, hearing the song preserved the event in their memory. The recording circulated widely and turned the Lawson murders into more than local grief. It was carried beyond Brook Cove by the power of music. Listeners learned the story not only from newspapers but from lyrics they could repeat and remember. In this way, the family became part of folk tradition, their deaths retold in song the same way other tragedies had been preserved for centuries. A generation later, the story was carried forward again. In 1956, the Stanley brothers recorded their own version of the ballad. By then, the Depression and wartime years had passed, yet the Lawson murders were still seen as a tale worth revisiting. The Stanley brothers brought it to new ears, ensuring the story could not fade into history. Folk audiences across the South learned again about the Lawson family through the pairing of banjo and voice. It showed how this event lived not just on the page, but in cultural memory that refused to grow quiet. That tradition of retelling never stopped. The case has continued to surface through new media. The PRX podcast Criminal produced an episode on the Lawson murders, bringing the story to modern listeners all across the world. Instead of a ballad on records, it appeared this time through headphones, introduced with the same careful tones of true crime storytelling that captivate audiences now. The format was different, but the effect was the same. The Lawson murders outlived their own community. Streaming platforms picked it up as well. In 2022, the Netflix series 28 Days Haunted included scenes connected to the Lawson case, particularly the place where the victims were embalmed. Even nearly a century later, producers saw value in returning to the horror and tying paranormal television to the history of the event. For a digital audience drawn to dark stories, the Lawson family once again became part of entertainment more than education. The case's endurance in modern media shows how tragedy evolves into shared folklore. Local facts turn into larger symbols, made portable in recordings, podcasts, and shows. And just as visitors once entered the family's house to look upon a covered cake, audiences today bring the story into their homes through sound and screen. What began as a singular act of violence grew into part of American horror memory, spread by culture's many ways of repeating stories. This transformation is uneasy. On one side, the Lawson murders remain a piercing family loss, remembered with grief by descendants. On the other side, they are history to thousands who never knew the family. Items once private became objects of gawking. A ballad written for radios in 1930 became an artifact of folk music, and in the 21st century, the same crime is discussed on podcasts and streamed through paranormal series. Every generation has found its own channel through which to retell the events. These retellings keep the case alive, long after newspapers stopped covering it, and long after the house returned to private use. Songs, stories, and recordings ensure that the Lawson name continues to appear in cultural memory. The objects remain in accounts. Marie's cake, covered in glass, the house opened by Marion Lawson, the music that spread from Columbia Records. Together, they built a structure of folklore around the case. Folklore fills where facts leave silence, and in the absence of Charlie Lawson's explanation, retellings became the only way to carry the story forward. The legacy is clear. What once happened in a farmhouse in Germantown travelled into ballads, then into records, then into digital podcasts and streaming platforms. What was once grief inside a family became grief and fascination shared across counties, then states, and now the world. The Lawson case lived on in stories, in music, and across media far beyond Brook Cove Road. In memory and in history, the story remains unresolved yet unforgettable. Welcome. Today I will cover one of Canada's most shocking true crime case. The story I am about to tell is the Jennifer Pan case. But before we start, please comment down where you live and what time it is there right now, and like the video. Let's start. A daughter calls 911, her voice shaking as she claims armed men have stormed her home. Her mother lies dying, her father critically injured, and Jennifer Pan insists she barely survived. But investigators soon notice something strange. Her story doesn't quite add up. Tonight, we retrace the steps of Jennifer Pan's 911 call, the shocking backstory, and how the truth unraveled. Stay with me, because what seemed like a random home invasion was anything but random. When Jennifer Pan picked up the phone and dialed emergency services, she sounded like a daughter in complete fear for her life. Her words came out uneven, with cracks in her voice that gave the impression of panic. She told the dispatcher that her house had been broken into, that her father was outside screaming, and that men had tied her up before shooting her parents. On the surface, this sounded like the plea of a victim, the kind of chaotic information police often hear when someone is facing a life or death event. During the first listen, it seemed to confirm her innocence, but replaying the tape slowly revealed details that did not fit the picture. Seasoned investigators, trained to pick up on unusual responses, began to notice moments where Jennifer's emotions seemed to vanish. In one part of the call, she cried out for help, then shifted into a measured and oddly calm tone as she explained the situation. This sudden change, almost like flipping a switch, is something professionals pay attention to. In real emergencies, most callers show spikes of panic that are inconsistent but constant in their urgency. They lose focus, words tumble out of order, and their fear does not fade in and out depending on the subject. Jennifer's ability to sound terrified one second and control the next presented the first sign that something was wrong with her story. Criminologists often explain that when people are under intense fear, their bodies betray them. Adrenaline floods the system. Breathing becomes shallow and rapid. Victims hyperventilate, forget details, or provide repetitive, jumbled statements that reflect their shock. If someone claims to be tied up while hearing a parent shot nearby, the expectation is that their voice would carry frantic disbelief throughout the entire call. In Jennifer's case, something felt different. Instead of raw panic, her pauses and carefully chosen words gave the impression that she wanted to sound distressed, but not lose coherence. That combination set off alarms for those listening closely. Forensic review of 911 calls is not uncommon. Experts have analysed hundreds of instances where words, silences, or tone gave away false claims. In Jennifer's call, one pause in particular stood out. While describing her father's screams, she suddenly stopped, as if calculating how to phrase what happened. The words that followed sounded deliberate, not the rushed sentences expected from someone overwhelmed by violence unfolding around them. To a dispatcher, these moments might have blended into the chaos of the night, but to police listening later in a quiet room, they were inconsistencies that begged closer attention. Another detail that created suspicion was Jennifer's physical state when first responders arrived. She told the operator she was tied to the upstairs banister and unable to move. Officers who reached the house found her bound, yes, but the restraints were far looser than expected. She had no cuts or marks that usually appear when tape or rope digs into skin during a struggle. Combine this with the fact that she was otherwise unharmed in an event where her parents had been shot, and the clean picture of a surviving victim grew harder to accept. In a true robbery gone wrong, intruders do not usually spare one witness while brutally attacking the others. Investigators began to wonder whether she was spared because she was never meant to be harmed in the first place. The contrast between her controlled composure and the deadly violence surrounding her parents only deepened the doubts. Police analysing the tape compared Jennifer's speech to other crisis calls where family members had just seen a parent shot. In one case, a man screamed incoherently for minutes before paramedics could understand him. In another, a daughter could barely string together a thought, her breath so laboured that dispatchers had to repeat questions several times. These examples highlighted the gulf between genuine terror and the strangely deliberate calm that surfaced again and again in Jennifer's statements. While she did cry and raise her voice at times, the structure of her sentences often returned to clarity, as though she wanted to make herself understood above everything else. What stood out most to detectives was the mix of dramatic flair and selective information. She described intruders, her father's screams, and her inability to escape, but her details often skipped over the exact sequence of how she was tied or why she was not executed alongside her parents. This selective recall, where some images were painted vividly while others conveniently faded into vagueness, gave the impression of someone shaping the narrative rather than relaying it. People in trauma do not edit stories, they spill them, fragments and all. Jennifer seemed too calculated in what she left in and out. At first, these doubts were not enough to accuse her. The call still held all the hallmarks of a young woman traumatized by something horrific. First responders treated her as the surviving daughter of a brutal home invasion. But as the hours passed, and the tape was replayed again and again, investigators began to shift their perspective. Instead of hearing the words of someone who barely escaped with her life, they started to hear the rehearsed rhythm of someone telling a scripted version of events. That shift in perception marked the true beginning of the case against Jennifer Pan. What she may have intended to use as proof of her innocence instead became the very thread that investigators tugged to unravel the entire story. One call, made in desperation, turned from evidence of survival to the first brick in a wall of suspicion. From that moment forward, every detail provided by Jennifer would be examined not just for accuracy, but for intent. Her carefully performed fear could only carry the story so far. Once police realized her calm moments did not align with true panic, they opened doors to questions about her character, her motives, and her history. They understood that something about this young woman's life, before that November night, might explain why she handled terror the way she did. And to understand why Jennifer was making this call at all, investigators and the public alike needed to go back to her childhood, her strict household, and the life she constructed behind a veil of lies. Only then with the strange tone of her voice that night, start to make sense. Jennifer Pan grew up in a home built on hard work and sacrifice. Her parents, Han and Bitch, were part of the group known as Viet Hoa, ethnic Chinese refugees from Vietnam, who had fled after the war. They reached Canada in the late 1970s and carried with them the scars of starting over with nothing. For them, settling in Ontario was not about comfort, it was about survival, and survival meant securing a future where their children would never face the instability they had endured. Every decision that followed, from their daily labour to their parenting style, came out of that mindset. Han took a job as a tool and die maker, while Bitch worked at Magna International producing car parts. Neither job was glamorous, but both provided steady paychecks. Fully aware of the chances they never had back home, they poured their energy into giving their children better opportunities. That desire translated into household rules that were far from flexible. Jennifer and her younger brother Felix were raised in Markham, a suburb of Toronto with a large immigrant community. The Pan home reflected values familiar to many first-generation families: strict oversight of academics, limited social freedom, and an emphasis on discipline. Education was viewed as the main path to social advancement, and Han in particular saw excellence as non-negotiable. A friend of Jennifer's would later call him a classic tiger dad. It was not meant as an insult so much as a descriptor of his relentless expectations. His wife Bitch took on the role of supporter in this approach, described as his reluctant accomplice. While she cared deeply about her children's happiness, she stayed aligned with her husband's standards, even when they pushed hard on Jennifer. Jennifer's routine was filled with activities designed to cultivate skill and resilience. She took music lessons where she studied theory and harmony. She played the flute in the school band, and at one time, she trained heavily in figure skating. There was genuine talent there, ambition even, and for a while she dreamed of competing as an Olympic skater. But dreams do not always align with reality. A knee injury cut short her skating life, and with it, one of the few outlets where she could excel outside academics. Without skating, her parents shifted expectations even more onto her school performance. With Felix still younger, Jennifer became the focal point for their investment of time, pressure, and hope. The weight of those expectations followed her everywhere. While many teenagers might attend dances or enjoy late nights with friends, Jennifer's world did not include such freedoms. Her parents refused to allow her to date, convinced it would distract her. They did not permit parties, and even closely monitored her friends and the hours she kept. Often, one parent would drive Jennifer to and from school, eliminating the chance of lingering on her own. If she went to lessons or extracurriculars, the same routine applied. The monitoring was constant, and the message was clear. Her purpose was to achieve, and there was little room left for normal teenage rebellion. That tension between her desires and her parents' demands left Jennifer with few outlets for self-expression. Classmates would spend weekends at social events or in casual relationships, while she remained absent, weaving occasional excuses about commitments at home. She understood the role her parents expected her to play, and by most outward impressions, she played it well. Bright, polite, and seemingly obedient, Jennifer fit the template of the child Han and Bitch wanted. But inside, she was beginning to feel the isolation of a life lived under observation. Every time she watched her peers enjoy freedoms she was not allowed, she felt a growing gap between the world she inhabited at home and the one she longed for outside. The emotional weight of this contradiction cannot be underestimated. During the later trial, Jennifer herself testified that she felt like a failure. For her, struggling to live up to high bars was not just about disappointing teachers or even herself. It was about the crushing sense that she was disappointing her parents, the two people who had built their lives around the idea that she would rise where they never could. It is one thing for a teenager to feel average in a world of achievers. It is another to feel that every step short of perfection is a cut into a parent's sacrifice. That emotional load created fertile ground for secrecy. This type of environment, labeled by some as tiger parenting, has often been debated in discussions of immigrant families. Advocates point out that it produces discipline, resilience, and achievement. Critics warn it can harm the child's psychological state when constant pressure is applied without space for individuality. For Jennifer, her reality was not abstract. She lived daily with oversight, firm rules, and strict guidelines. She had structure, but very limited trust. She had focus, but no autonomy. The balance tipped unevenly toward achievement, with little space for trial and error. As time went on, Jennifer found her desire for independence growing stronger. She wanted to be like her classmates who could date openly, attend school dances, or simply hang out without an interrogation. She also wanted recognition for who she was outside of grades and accomplishments. Her parents did not see these wants as part of her success story. They saw them as distractions threatening to derail years of effort. The result was a clash not only of values, but of perspectives. Han and Bitch viewed themselves as protectors, steering their daughter towards secure success. Jennifer increasingly saw them as wardens in a prison built out of expectations. When she began hiding small things from her parents, it was not initially about rebellion. It was about survival in an environment where telling the whole truth meant inevitable punishment. If she struggled in school, it was safer to avoid the conversation than to admit weakness. If she had an interest in boys, it was easier to keep it private than to fight over restrictions. Little by little, these omissions became part of her communication pattern. She was not yet living a full double life, but her silence and excuses were beginning to lay the groundwork. This gradual shift into secrecy was the predictable outcome of the world in which she grew up. With no room for compromise, Jennifer learned to compartmentalize. She presented the model daughter to her parents, while internally carrying guilt and growing bitterness. From their perspective, they had built a concrete plan for her future, fortified by rules that would keep her on track. From her perspective, she was trapped in a cycle of expectations she could not fully meet and was not allowed to question. The seeds of deception were already planted long before the night she called 911. The Pan household, structured on discipline and success, had produced a girl who learned that hiding was the only way to cope. She did not rebel outwardly the way some teens might. Instead, her resistance took the form of stories and omissions, and those seeds would grow larger over the years to come. Small lies that seemed harmless in the moment became practice for something else, a staged version of reality, a game to maintain appearances. The strict rules had created a situation where truth began to feel more dangerous than lies. In that pressurized environment, Jennifer started building the framework of the life her parents wanted to see and the entirely different life she wanted for herself. And it was only a matter of time before those hidden parts would spiral into a carefully constructed double life that no one in the Pan household could have imagined. By the time Jennifer Pan entered high school, the pressure in her household was clear. Her parents expected nothing less than perfect marks, and for a while, she could make them believe she was meeting those standards. The truth, however, was different. In most of her classes, Jennifer's grades hovered in the 70s, a respectable level for many students, but far from the straight, as her parents demanded. There was only one subject where she excelled naturally: music. But that was not enough to satisfy the future her parents had imagined for her. With every poor test result, the fear of bringing it home grew stronger, and with that fear came a decision that would change the way she lived her life. Instead of admitting her difficulties, Jennifer learned how to bend reality into the shape her parents wanted to see. She began making changes to her report cards, turning average grades into inflated numbers, forged progress reports with penciled in, as made their way into her parents' hands, and they celebrated a success that did not exist. For Han and Bitch, their daughter appeared to be thriving. For Jennifer, each new forgery bought her a little more time. What started as a way to cover one disappointing mark evolved into a survival tactic. Once the first fabricated document worked, the temptation to repeat it was impossible to ignore. Covering up became routine. Every semester brought new challenges, and every semester required more creativity to hide them. Calculated edits on official documents soon escalated into more ambitious fraud. Jennifer did not just alter grades, she created an entire illusion of academic achievement. She wrote fake acceptance letters to universities, proof that her hard work had paid off. When Ryerson University rescinded her early admission after she failed calculus in grade 12, she could not bring herself to share the truth. Confessing failure to her parents seemed unthinkable. The only option she saw was to expand her lies. And expand she did. To keep up the appearance of attending university, Jennifer developed an elaborate story. She borrowed second-hand textbooks and filled notebooks with carefully written notes copied from pharmacology videos, showing them to her parents as evidence of her studies. To anyone else, this might have seemed like too much effort. But to Jennifer, it was the cost of keeping her parents' perception intact. She even told them she had won scholarships, piling accomplishment upon accomplishment that did not exist. Each false claim raised their expectations higher, which made the reality of her situation all the more impossible to reveal. Maintaining the illusion required structure. Jennifer would leave the house at the time her parents thought she was heading to campus, then spend hours in libraries or with friends, creating the appearance of a typical student schedule. She told them she had labs to attend, exams to prepare for, and assignments to finish. At home, she reinforced these stories with her stacks of study materials. There was a rhythm to it. one that became as natural as breathing. The more convincing the performance, the safer she felt. But it also meant that with every success in lying, her ability to tell the truth grew smaller. Han and Bitch believed their daughter was advancing toward medical school. They told friends about her academic path with pride, certain her future was secure. This good news spread through their community, creating an image of Jennifer as the ideal daughter, disciplined and destined for success. Every time her parents shared these supposed accomplishments, Jennifer's false world gained another layer of validation. She could not take it back without unraveling everything at once. Instead, she leaned further into deception, convincing herself it was worth it to protect her parents from disappointment. Her lies became more than protection. They became identity. At home, she was the driven student on her way to a medical career. In reality, she was a young woman, struggling academically, anxious about failure, and buried in the weight of expectations she could not meet. The gap between those two versions of her life kept widening. To her parents, she was an inspiration. In private, she was building an empire of forgeries. That dual existence required constant maintenance. Every new semester forced another invention. Every chance encounter with reality threatened to destroy it all. The effort was draining, but giving up seemed impossible. There was always another cover story to write, another piece of evidence to forge. When friends asked probing questions or when her parents pressed for more detail, she learned to think quickly, offering enough information to maintain trust without revealing the truth. In quiet moments, she probably knew how fragile her setup was. Yet, she kept feeding it, convinced it was safer to live inside the construction than to risk being exposed. This was not only about preserving her parents' pride, it was about control. For so long, Jennifer had been the subject of choices made for her: what to study, how to spend her time, even who to see. In fabricating her life, she carved out space where she decided the script. The irony was that this control was only possible through deception, and deception had its limits. Each success bound her tighter to the lies, until the line between her real self and the one her parents believed in became nearly impossible to separate. By the time she began pretending to attend the University of Toronto, Jennifer had turned deception into daily practice. Some people fake a story and stop, leaving it behind with regret. Jennifer built a lifestyle around it. Lying was no longer a choice. It was the foundation that held together her relationship with her family. It gave her parents stories to be proud of, and it gave Jennifer a shield from the disappointment she feared more than anything else. But it also left her trapped. With every passing year, she had to invent more, spend more energy, and tie herself further to a version of life that could never be real. What began with a simple change on a high school report card had grown into something far larger than Jennifer may have ever intended. She was not just hiding a low grade anymore. She was fabricating an entire future. It was no longer only about buying time, but about sustaining appearances at all costs. And while her parents celebrated the daughter they thought they had raised, Jennifer was sinking further into deceit. The expectation of success had given her no space to admit failure, and in the silence of that gap, she created lies big enough to live inside. Over time, deception became her second nature, stitched into every conversation and every family interaction. She had become skilled at maintaining parallel versions of her life, managing them with precision, but this precision came at a price. Each added layer made it harder to ever come clean. By building her life on fiction, she had set herself on a path where the truth was not only buried but unsafe. It was a pattern that only grew stronger as she stepped further into adulthood. Jennifer Pan met Daniel Wong when they were teenagers in high school. From the beginning, their connection stood out not because it was extraordinary, but because it was not allowed. For Jennifer, raised under constant watch in a controlled household, Daniel represented the one thing she was not supposed to have. He worked at a Boston pizza restaurant, later becoming a manager there, and also had a side involvement in marijuana dealing. To Han and Bitch, Daniel was not the picture of stability they demanded for their daughter. In their eyes, he was unsuitable in every way, but for Jennifer, Daniel became the symbol of the freedom she had been missing. Being with Daniel gave her something her life at home never did: a sense of choice. She could decide to see him, even if it was only in secret. She could be herself without always playing the role of top student and obedient daughter. Their relationship was ordinary on many levels, consisting of the kinds of dates and late-night conversations most high school couples share. Yet the very fact that it was forbidden made it feel more powerful. It was not just love, it was relief from all the weight she carried at home. When her parents eventually found out about the relationship, they responded in the way Jennifer expected. They banned it completely. Any form of dating was considered a distraction, but Daniel's background sealed the decision. Han and Bitch insisted she end it, cutting off one of the only lifelines she felt connected to the outside world. What they intended as discipline instead deepened her attachment to Daniel. The secrecy of continuing to see him made their connection stronger. To Jennifer, this was no longer a simple relationship, it was rebellion. The effort required to keep Daniel hidden was exhausting, but it also gave her a sense of power. In a life where most choices were made for her, she now had something entirely her own. Lying to her parents about grades and school life had already become her pattern. Extending those lies to cover a secret romance only solidified how far she was willing to go to maintain control over some part of her identity. The more her parents pushed, the more she clung to Daniel as proof that she could live by her own rules. Friends later described Jennifer as someone who desperately wanted independence. With Daniel, that independence felt real. They had to plan carefully. Meeting places were arranged, messages exchanged, and excuses crafted to cover gaps in time. Every successful meeting behind her parents' backs reinforced the idea that their control was not absolute, that she could outsmart them. This was thrilling to Jennifer, but it was also a dangerous reinforcement. The secrecy turned the relationship into something more consuming than it might have been under normal circumstances. As their relationship grew, tension at home grew with it. Every confrontation with her parents became charged with resentment. She began to see them less as protectors and more as obstacles standing between her and her happiness. For teenagers, such feelings are not uncommon, but in Jennifer's life the stakes felt higher. Years of strict rules, the web of lies surrounding school, and now the forbidden relationship, all combined to create a deep sense of entrapment. She did not simply want freedom, she felt she needed it to survive. There was also the matter of image. Han and Bitch believed Jennifer was a model student destined for success, someone who would someday become a doctor or a pharmacist. Jennifer played that role daily, but with Daniel she did not have to. With him, she could be the version of herself that her parents would never accept. That difference made being with him not just comforting, but essential. When pressure at home increased, she leaned harder into the relationship, finding in it the escape she could not get anywhere else. The secrecy also had a bonding effect. Psychologists often note that forbidden relationships can feel more intense because the struggle to maintain them turns each partner into the other's only ally. That was the case for Jennifer and Daniel. For her, every risk of being caught was proof of her commitment. For him, the restrictions made being with Jennifer feel like a mission they were on together. The hidden texts, the planned encounters, and the fear of discovery did not weaken their relationship. They strengthened it. This shift did not go unnoticed by her parents. The more Jennifer resisted, the more they doubled down on their rules. They viewed Daniel as a threat and acted accordingly. Once again, what they considered necessary protection only fueled Jennifer's determination to resist. Every threat of punishment made her more certain that her parents were the problem, not Daniel, and every moment spent planning around them eroded what little trust remained between them. Resentment soon began to dominate her view of her parents. Rather than appreciating their sacrifices, Jennifer grew convinced they were barriers to her happiness. She watched friends move freely in relationships, pursue normal lives, and make choices without every detail scrutinized. In contrast, she lived in a house where every action was measured. It reinforced an us versus them mentality, with Daniel becoming her partner not only in romance, but in defiance. Having experienced some level of control over her school lies, Jennifer began to imagine that she could manage this situation too. But unlike academics, romance had emotional stakes that were harder to contain. Her attachment to Daniel was not built only on affection, it was reinforced by the thrill of forbidden love and the urgency of needing someone on her side. By making him the symbol of her independence, she risked making her parents seem like the enemies in a conflict where compromise felt impossible. As her double life expanded, Jennifer stood at the crossroads of two realities. In one, she was the daughter her parents expected, dutiful, high-achieving, and obedient. In the other, she was the partner in a secret relationship where she could make her own choices, even if those choices were based on deception. These two versions of Jennifer could not exist together forever. The more intense her relationship became, the more fragile her performance at home grew. Eventually, confrontation was bound to follow. When it finally did, and when her parents discovered yet more lies surrounding her life, they responded with drastic measures. They issued an ultimatum, one that restricted her freedoms even further and pushed her deeper into desperation. What they could not see was how the forbidden relationship had shifted Jennifer's mindset. It was not just about wanting a boyfriend anymore. It was about wanting control of her own existence, no matter the cost. That drive for independence, sharpened by secrecy and strengthened by defiance, would become the turning point in Jennifer's life. The hidden romance had given her a kind of courage, but it was courage built on lies and rebellion. It showed her that rules could be broken without immediate destruction, and it planted the idea that her parents' control could be resisted in more extreme ways. The forbidden bond between Jennifer and Daniel was not simply one obstacle in her path, it became the foundation for what came next. And when her parents brought everything to a breaking point with new restrictions, Jennifer's desperation turned from secrecy and lies into something far more dangerous. By the time Jennifer's web of lies began to come apart, her parents' patience had worn thin. It was not just school reports or fabricated achievements anymore. They realized how deeply she had been deceiving them, not only about academics, but also about her relationship with Daniel Wong. For Han Pan in particular, it was the last straw. He had worked hard to build a life in Canada, and his vision of success centered on his children reaching careers he never could. Watching that plan collapse under dishonesty and defiance ignited a tougher response. What followed was an ultimatum that would change the course of everything. The restrictions came fast and without compromise. Jennifer was told she could no longer see Daniel. Contact of any kind was forbidden. Her parents took away her phone when they were home, cutting off her ability to communicate freely. Every movement she made outside the house was monitored. If she left for work, piano lessons, or school-related responsibilities, one of her parents drove her there and picked her up again. To Han and Bitch, this was a way to regain control. To Jennifer, it felt like another wall being built around her. Han took the lead in enforcing the rules. Friends of the family later remembered how much pride he took in structure and how determined he was to repair what he saw as Jennifer's drifting life. His solution was supervision. He made the boundaries clear, and he expected her to obey without exception. From his perspective, this was the only way to stop more lies from spiraling. According to his own testimony, he even warned Jennifer directly about Daniel. "End it now," he said, "or wait till I am dead." It was a striking line that revealed how firmly he believed this relationship stood in the way of her future. Jennifer, however, experienced this differently. Instead of feeling guided, she felt trapped. At school, classmates her age were making their own decisions, pursuing relationships, and finding independence. At home, she was a young adult, still being driven to and from every location. Her phone checked, her social life erased. She had built her teenage years around secrecy, creating spaces where she could pretend to have autonomy. Now even the illusion was gone. Every hour was under watch. Every attempt to stretch for independence was blocked. The sense of isolation tightened. Her parents thought discipline would save her. Jennifer believed it was cutting off her only oxygen. By forbidding Daniel, they attacked the one part of her life that felt like hers. To remove him meant removing hope that she could live outside their strict expectations. Rather than pulling her back onto the path they envisioned, the ultimatum closed her off further. At night, her thoughts circled around the impossible situation. She was not just under rules, she was in a cage. From the outside, constant monitoring might have looked like tough love parents trying to reset boundaries after years of lies. But inside Jennifer's world, the decision hardened resentment. Where she once felt guilty for deceiving, she now defined lying as survival. Rules designed to break the bond with Daniel only fused them closer. Rules meant to heal the breach between daughter and parents only widened the cracks. The ultimatum was a test of obedience. But Jennifer did not see it as a choice. She saw it as the moment her parents stood entirely in the way of her future. This mindset escalated quickly. When a child sees parents as guardians of opportunity, discipline can be tolerated, but when a young adult sees parents as barriers to freedom, efforts at control can ignite defiance. For Jennifer, who had already lived years constructing fictions to please them, the next step moved far beyond another forgery or excuse. She began imagining life without their interference at all. It was at this emotional boiling point that the thought hardened into possibility. If her parents would not allow her to be with Daniel or have independence, then perhaps the only escape was to remove them from the equation entirely. What had started as pressure to meet high marks and obedience had turned into a spiral of lies. The ultimatum forced her to face a wall she could neither climb over nor negotiate, and in her mind, the only solution became erasing the wall itself. The hard truth is that many young adults in strict homes dream about escape. Some leave home early, others build distance gradually. Jennifer had been trained by years of secrecy to see deceit as her primary tool. When her parents cut off every avenue, she did not look for open discussion or compromise. She looked for permanence, elimination, freedom through absence. Han and Bitch, of course, did not imagine discipline would lead here. They were parents who believed order would save their family. but their determination to set limits collided with Jennifer's determination to escape them. This clash was more than generational. It was a full standoff. One side unbending in rules, the other unbending in desire. Neither side could accept the other. As the days passed under strict watch, Jennifer's thoughts moved from frustration to planning. Each ride to school reinforced her lack of control. Each search of her phone reminded her that nothing was private. Each condition pushed her further towards seeing life not as something to endure, but something to escape by drastic means. In her mind, discipline had ended the possibility of choices. In its place came dark decisions that would shock everyone around her. By then, the idea of removing her parents was no longer a passing fantasy. It grew into concrete consideration. Who would do it? How would it look? What would life be like afterward? These were not questions asked by chance, but questions asked as part of forming a plan. And the first step of that plan would be reaching out to people who might be willing to carry out what she could not. The ultimatum meant to save Jennifer from her double life did not work. It backfired. It marked the line where her lies, her secrecy, and her resentment transformed into something lethal. Her restrictions became her motive. Her sense of entrapment became her justification. And for the first time, she began to imagine not a future dictated by expectation, but a future free of her parents altogether. That shift in thought was decisive. Discipline was supposed to correct her mistakes. Instead, it convinced her to pursue a way out that no parent could have foreseen. Jennifer had reached a point where compromise no longer seemed possible in her mind. After years of deception, years of being watched, and years of trying to live in two worlds, she believed she had arrived at her final option. But how does someone even move from the idea of escape to connecting with people who would kill? How does a young woman in suburban Ontario find individuals willing to carry out a murder for hire? Those questions defined the next stage of the story, as Jennifer's desperation shifted from thought into action. Jennifer Pan told Daniel Wong that she wanted her parents gone. For her, the restrictions at home had become unbearable, and she convinced herself that killing them was the only way to live freely. At first, this was only talk, but it soon shifted into action. Rather than planning an escape from her household, Jennifer began looking for people who could carry out something far more extreme. What started as private complaints turned into serious discussions about murder for hire, arranged through Daniel and his contacts. Her first attempts were clumsy. Investigators later learned that she had spoken to acquaintances like Andrew Montemayor and Ricardo Duncan about finding someone who might do the job. Nothing came of these early interactions, but they showed the direction her thoughts were taking. Jennifer was no longer imagining alternatives to her life at home. She was actively asking about ways to make death a solution. These failed attempts did not stop her. Instead, they primed her for the next step with Daniel, who had closer ties to people willing to consider the request. With Daniel's involvement, the idea gained focus. He introduced her indirectly to individuals tied to criminal circles, including Lenford, Roy Crawford. Jennifer's communication with them was not reckless. It was hidden. She used a separate SIM card and iPhone, devices purchased and kept separate from the phone her parents monitored, to carry out conversations about the plan. The use of this equipment was later a key piece of evidence. It showed how she had taken deliberate steps to mask what she was doing, not just in her home but in every aspect of her daily routine. The conversations soon shifted from vague interests to concrete planning. Money was central. Jennifer claimed she could pay $10,000 for the killings. That money, according to accounts presented later, would come from her future inheritance. She believed she stood to receive around $500,000 once her parents were gone. The lure of that financial independence, combined with her desire to be with Daniel outside her parents' control, made the idea more real. It tied love and freedom together with profit, giving her more than one reason to push forward. At first, Jennifer's target was only her father, Han. He had taken the lead on enforcing the ultimatum, and in her mind, he was the harshest barrier to her relationship and freedom. But her view shifted. Leaving her mother alive meant that control and disapproval would remain in the house. If she wanted to be rid of all restraints, then both parents would need to be gone. That change in the plan, from one victim to two, was a major shift. It clarified to those who later studied the case that she had decided on total removal rather than partial escape. The agreements continued through a network rather than direct contracts. Daniel remained her point of contact, bridging between Jennifer and others, like Crawford and Eric Sean Carty, who played roles in connecting with David Mulvaganam, the man charged as one of the shooters. This chain of communication gave Jennifer some distance from those who would actually commit the acts, but it also demonstrated a layer of planning that added weight to the charges. She had not been impulsive. She had gone looking for a structured way to see her parents killed. The timing and coordination were not random either. Records later displayed more than 100 text messages exchanged between Jennifer and Daniel in the hours leading up to the attack. These were not casual notes. They were check-ins, confirmations, and reminders that revealed the build-up to the night of the crime. Each message was part of a countdown, narrowing the distance between years of deception and the violence that would follow. It is important to recognize that her motive was not only emotional or financial, but both. On one hand, Jennifer wanted Daniel and the freedom of being with him without restrictions. On the other, she saw the possibility of securing a large inheritance that could finance a new life. Together, these goals reinforced each other. Free from parents, she would have independence. With inheritance, she would have security. The idea wrapped itself into a vision of life she thought she could finally control. When presented at trial, this combination of financial expectation and emotional desperation became a central theme. Prosecutors argued that Jennifer was not only tired of her parents' control, but motivated by the wealth their deaths would provide. In their telling, this was not just about stress or youthful rebellion. It was about planning cold, organized, and committed. The $10,000 price tag showed how far she was willing to go, reducing her parents' lives to a transaction that could be settled with cash. The details also raised questions of complexity. Why pursue murder instead of escape? Why not move away or cut ties? For Jennifer, those alternatives must not have felt possible. Her years of lying had closed off simpler paths. In her mind, the only way to avoid exposure and rejection was to eliminate the source of pressure altogether. By choosing this route, she escalated conflict with her parents into a decision that was permanent. The secrecy, forged over years, now served its darkest purpose. By the time everything was in place, Jennifer had moved from forging grades and fabricating her education to arranging the most irreversible deception of all. She was no longer playing student, no longer pretending loyalty. She was shaping a reality where inheriting money and living with Daniel would replace the life she had at home. It was not escape in the sense of leaving quietly. It was escape through orchestrated death, carried out through people who would break into her family home. For the conspirators, the plan looked simple. Stage the scene as a home invasion robbery. Keep Jennifer alive so she appeared to be a victim. Make the murders look like the violent aftermath of a break-in. This setup was supposed to hide her role and leave her free to collect what she wanted. The chain of planning, the devices bought to conceal communication, the money promised, these all formed the structure of a crime that was meant to look accidental. Jennifer had started with complaints about strict parents and dreams of life with Daniel. She ended with a structured agreement for their destruction, putting a dollar amount on freedom and linking it to inheritance. What should have been conversations about growing independence had turned into arrangements for murder. Instead of finding another path forward in life, Jennifer prepared a path through death. Once the plan was in place, time was the only barrier. Jennifer and Daniel had laid the groundwork, reached the people willing to carry it out, and prepared the frame of the cover story in advance. They were past imagining and into awaiting execution. And the moment that awaited them arrived on a cold November night when three men stepped into the Pan household and shattered it forever. On the night of November 8th, 2010, the Pan family house in Markham, Ontario, looked quiet from the outside. Inside, Jennifer Pan was upstairs in her room, keeping in touch with Daniel Wong over text. The conversation was not casual. Records later showed that she was coordinating last details of the plan that had been forming for months. Her parents, Han and Bitch, had gone about their evening unaware that anything unusual was about to happen. For them, it was just another Monday night. At some point after Jennifer exchanged those messages, she made sure the front door was unlocked. This detail would later matter to investigators because there was no sign of forced entry. The men who arrived did not have to break in. They walked directly inside. Three men entered the Pan house, moving with purpose and demanding money. Jennifer stayed upstairs, listening as her plan took shape in real time. Her role was to appear a victim, not a participant. The men confronted Han and Bitch quickly. Both parents were startled, and the situation turned physical when the intruders brandished guns and ordered them to comply. Using duct tape, they bound Han and Bitch, forcing them to lie face down. The tape was applied tightly around their arms and heads, leaving little room for movement or air. Jennifer, by contrast, was soon tied herself, but in a way that seemed unusual. Instead of being restrained harshly, her wrists were tied loosely to the banister. Her bindings would allow enough slack for her to move her fingers later and dial her phone. That difference, the harsh treatment of her parents and the gentle restraint of Jennifer, would not go unnoticed. In the middle of the chaos, Han and Bitch were forced toward the master bedroom, while demands for cash continued. The men searched the room and grabbed what they could, including about $2,000 in cash from Jennifer herself. Large valuables, however, were mysteriously untouched. Electronics, jewelry, and other signs of wealth that robbers usually target were left behind. At the time, this looked strange, but in the dark urgency of the moment, the parents had no time to process why. They were under direct threat, dragged by armed men who appeared determined to inflict violence. The invaders' ultimate destination was the basement. Han and Bitch were led down the stairs, duct tape again pressed to their faces and eyes. Jennifer, still upstairs near the banister, was not moved along with them. This separation made her the only family member spared from direct gunfire. Downstairs, the men positioned her parents on the floor. Without hesitation, shots rang out. Han was struck in the head but not killed immediately. Bitch, his wife, suffered multiple gunshot wounds that ended her life in the basement of the family home. Jennifer remained upstairs during this. Accounts confirm she did not cry out as many would expect. She gave the 911 dispatcher later an impression of panic, but at the moment, violence was unfolding below. She appeared restrained, almost composed. Her bindings left her largely unharmed, as though her role was meant to be surviving witness rather than target. This outcome suited the story she and Daniel had fashioned, a staged robbery that left her alive to report it. Minutes later, the three men fled the house. With them, they carried a small amount of cash but left behind many other valuables. Police would later call this another indicator that robbery was never the true motive. Once gone, Jennifer managed to use her loosely bound hands to retrieve her phone and call 911. On that call, she begged for help, framing herself as the terrified daughter who had barely survived. At first, to the dispatcher, it sounded convincing. When officers arrived at the Pan home, they found Bitch's body in the basement. Han lay nearby, bleeding heavily from his head wound. The scene was violent, littered with duct tape and chaos. But what struck officers was Jennifer herself. She was upstairs, uninjured beyond the flimsy tape that barely held her. Unlike her parents, she showed no signs of rough treatment, no imprints on her skin from tight bindings, and no indication that she had struggled. For a supposed robbery gone wrong, this seemed unusual. At the hospital that night, doctors worked quickly to save Han Pan. Against odds, he survived multiple gunshot wounds, though the attack left him blind in one eye and severely impaired in the other. His survival would become pivotal, because while Jennifer's version of events painted her as another victim, Han's eventual testimony would reveal contradictions. For now, though, he lay in critical condition, his voice unable to share what he had seen and heard in that basement. The image presented to investigators at first glance was staged, but not well. A robbery designed for realism would have included more effort to loot valuables. It would have restricted Jennifer with force equal to her parents. It would not have left her able to call for help so quickly. Each of these smaller details stacked together to create something police could not overlook. Jennifer's behavior was another piece of the puzzle. At the scene, witnesses recalled she was distraught, but not in a state consistent with someone who had watched a parent gunned down. Her tears came at intervals. Her voice rose high when repeating to officers what had happened, but moments later, she would calm and appear ready to answer questions clearly. That alternating rhythm struck some investigators as rehearsed. Forensic work reinforced suspicion. No doorframe had been damaged, no window was pried. The intruders entered calmly through a door Jennifer herself admitted leaving unlocked. In most robbery cases, victims are treated roughly to avoid witnesses later identifying the offenders. But in this case, Jennifer was clearly spared harm. The invasion appeared to have less interest in property and more focus on those two parents. In the days following, the picture began to shift. Han's survival meant he could speak. Once he regained consciousness, he slowly shared his account. How the men led him and his wife downstairs, how Jennifer remained upstairs, and how the entire sequence unfolded without her being treated as a true hostage. His memories provided investigators with a direct contradiction to Jennifer's story that she had been helpless throughout. The so-called robbery now looked like something more coordinated. The intruders had followed a path directly in line with Jennifer's preparation. They were not random burglars stumbling upon a house with wealthy occupants. They were there for a targeted purpose. And when one of the two intended victims lived long enough to describe it, the deception Jennifer had carefully built started to crumble. What happened in the Pan household that November night could no longer be explained away as a brutal accident of circumstance. It was the consequence of planning, deception, and intentional violence. Jennifer had wanted the scene staged, as if she survived a home invasion. but her father's survival shattered that image. His recovery offered the testimony that exposed cracks too big to ignore. With Han still in recovery, police began comparing his version with Jennifer's recorded call. Each inconsistency pushed them closer to doubt. Each difference suggested that what happened was no random act of terror, but a crime written into the very walls of the family home before that night even began. And soon, the survivor's testimony would become the key in unraveling Jennifer's entire story. Doctors at Sunnybrook Hospital in Toronto could hardly believe that Han Pan was still alive. He had been shot at close range in the face and had also suffered wounds that left him in critical condition. At first, it seemed almost certain that he would not survive. He was rushed there after being stabilized at a smaller local hospital, and when he finally regained consciousness, it was described as extraordinary. His survival was not just a miracle of medicine, it became the key that changed the entire investigation into the attack on the Pan family. Still heavily injured, Han began to speak about what he remembered that night. These details became vital because Jennifer's 911 call had presented her as a terrified young woman, helplessly bound while intruders destroyed her family. Investigators had already questioned this version of events, but until Han was able to talk, they lacked a first-hand witness to confirm the suspicions that had begun forming. His testimony proved to be the thread that tied everything together. Han told police that during the invasion, his daughter had not appeared to be treated roughly at all. He recalled her speaking quietly to one of the men, but not in the kind of panicked tone he expected. Instead, in his words, she whispered to the gunman, in a friendly and soft manner. This stood in stark contrast to the girl who later sobbed to the 911 dispatcher that she had been kidnapped and could not move. For police, this was no minor contradiction. It was the first clear indication from a victim that Jennifer had been spared and that her behavior seemed suspicious. As investigators compared Han's account with Jennifer's, more gaps became obvious. She had described the invasion as terrifying chaos, yet Han remembered watching her sit away from the violence, apparently unharmed, and interacting with the intruders in ways that did not match a frightened hostage. Jennifer claimed she was tightly bound, yet managed to call police within minutes after the gunmen left. Han confirmed that while he and Bitch had tape wrapped tightly over their heads and bodies, his daughter's restraints were not applied the same way. These mismatches added weight to the feeling that the robbery story was not genuine. The fact that Han could even describe what had happened gave the investigation momentum it would not have had otherwise. If he had died that night, Jennifer's account might have stood much longer without contradiction, but his voice gave detectives reason to dig more aggressively. Han remembered details, being led downstairs, being left with his wife, and hearing his daughter upstairs when she was supposedly in danger too. He remembered the gunfire and how he blacked out from the shots, certain he was dying. That he awoke later in a hospital bed, still able to recall the final minutes before he collapsed, was remarkable. For prosecutors, Han's survival created a turning point. Jennifer's entire performance relied on the idea that she was a victim, yet her own father, the man she had targeted, was still alive and testifying about her unusual behavior. It was impossible to dismiss or explain away. His statement about her whispering gently to the gunman was particularly damaging. It suggested a level of familiarity that could not fit into her role as an innocent daughter. That single observation raised the possibility that she was cooperating with the intruders rather than hiding from them. The physical evidence already left investigators uneasy. There was no forced entry. Valuables were left untouched, and Jennifer was unharmed. But with Han's testimony layered on top, the story hardened. It painted a picture of selective brutality, where one family member was spared by design, while the others were bound and shot. Han became proof of that distinction. His wife was murdered. He himself was nearly killed. Yet Jennifer walked away with nothing more than light tape on her arms. These facts could not be ignored, and now they were being said aloud by the surviving victim. Han's willingness to testify also carried emotional weight. He had lost his wife, suffered life-changing injuries, and discovered that the daughter he raised was not the victim she claimed to be. Despite that, he chose to talk. Each detail about the night added layers to the prosecution's case, while also dismantling the daughter's carefully created role. Whatever sympathy her tearful calls had won began to fade once her father's version was heard. At trial, Han's survival was presented as both extraordinary and devastating. Extraordinary in the sense that very few survive such close-range shots. Devastating, because his testimony directly implicated his own child. Without him, the Crown would have relied far more on cell phone records and circumstantial evidence. With him, they had words from the man who was there. That made the difference between suspicion and certainty. Jennifer's scheme had relied on silence. Her plan demanded that both parents die so that no one inside the house could contradict her story, but her father's survival had undone everything. By living, Han had destroyed the narrative she had worked so hard to stage. His voice shifted the case from wondering if she was lying to proving she had been. The police no longer had to rely only on tone analysis of her 911 call or speculation about loose duct tape. They had the surviving victim himself, explaining how his daughter's role that night was not what she claimed. For Jennifer, every moment her father spoke in court was another wall collapsing. His testimony left her without the protection of her own family's silence. Instead, the truth was coming directly from him. The very man she had planned to erase became the crucial witness exposing her. As one detective later described, Han's survival was fatal to Jennifer's fabricated story. The brutality of that November night had left Han permanently injured. He lost vision in one eye and lived with lasting trauma from the attack. Yet his recollections became the key to exposing his daughter's role in orchestrating what happened. The investigation gained credibility not from advanced technology or hidden informants, but from the surviving parent himself. He had seen enough, remembered enough, and said enough to unravel his daughter's version of events. In many ways, the unraveling did not depend on investigators alone. It depended on the patient testimony of a father who was not supposed to live long enough to speak. His voice took the crime from a mystery about home invaders to an undeniable case of conspiracy between daughter and hitmen. Jennifer's attempt to appear like a survivor was undone by the survival of someone else, the very person meant to die. Han's survival turned into the prosecution's strongest weapon. More than text messages, more than inconsistencies, his memory carried power. As a result, Jennifer's lies began to collapse under their own weight. She could no longer shape the story. Her father's testimony had anchored the truth, and there was no way around it. Now, with the key victim alive and revealing what he saw, detectives had leverage they needed. It was time to press Jennifer herself. The next critical step in the process became the police interrogations, where inconsistencies in her story would be tested until they broke. In the weeks after the attack, Jennifer Pan was treated as a traumatized survivor, but investigators could not ignore the gaps in her account. With her father recovering and giving them key details, detectives decided it was time to press her harder. On November 22nd, 2010, she was called in for another interview at the York Regional Police Station in Markham. By then, she had already spoken with officers twice, always sticking to her story of being a helpless hostage. This time, however, detectives had a different approach lined up. The interview room was small and windowless, bare except for a table and two chairs. Detective William Goetz, a veteran familiar with tough questioning, was assigned to speak with her. He relied on the Reed technique, a method often taught to interrogators across North America. That approach is built around confrontation and psychological tactics, including deception about evidence. Legally, police in Canada are allowed to mislead suspects during questioning, and Goetz intended to use that advantage. It was not about physical pressure, but about reshaping her view of the facts, convincing her that denial was no longer an option. From the start, Jennifer repeated her earlier claims. She cast herself as the terrified daughter, tied to a banister, while strangers destroyed her family. She cried, and her voice trembled, but Goetz did not accept her story at face value. Instead, he challenged her with the inconsistencies detectives had already noticed. Why were her bindings so loose compared to her parents? Why was she left unharmed when the others were shot? Why were valuables in plain sight ignored? These points had raised suspicion since the night of the crime. Now, in that room, each one was placed directly in front of her. When Jennifer stuck to her script, the detective shifted strategies. He began introducing claims about advanced investigative tools. At one point, he told her they had computer systems capable of analyzing the truthfulness of her statements. Later, he described satellite technology he said could track movements inside homes using infrared scans. None of this was real, but the point was not the tools themselves. The goal was to convince Jennifer that the police already knew more than she realized, that resisting would only make things worse. Faced with what she thought was overwhelming forensic proof, her confidence in her lies began to fracture. Hours into the questioning, her story started to bend. She first suggested that perhaps she was not simply a random victim at all, but that she had been the real target. At one point, she told Goetz that the whole event was connected to a supposed ransom scheme. According to this version, intruders had come for her, not her parents. It was a surprising shift, but it also deepened suspicions. The logic made little sense. Why would kidnappers shoot her parents and leave her unharmed. Each change she introduced only made the cracks in her narrative more obvious. The detective pushed on these weak points. He reminded her that her overall behavior during the night had not matched fear. He brought up her father's testimony that she had spoken softly to one of the gunmen, almost like a friendly exchange. He told her the evidence showed she had been orchestrating parts of the evening. Confronted again and again with contradictions, Jennifer had no space to retreat. The pressure to explain herself built steadily with every question. After more than 2 hours in that room, Jennifer finally broke. Her admission did not come all at once. At first, she claimed she had been involved, but only because she wanted to end her own life. She told Goetz she had arranged for people to come into the house and kill her, not her parents. It was a confession, but framed in a way that cast her as desperate and self-destructive, not violent toward others. Detectives did not buy it. The reasoning clashed with the facts, and they had text messages linking her to discussions about targeting her parents, not herself. Once she admitted making contact with men willing to kill, the walls she had built around her story started to collapse. Investigators did not care if she presented it as a suicide plot or a failed contract. The important point was that she had acknowledged involvement. Her claim that she had tried to stage her own death allowed them to tighten the noose on her connection to Daniel Wong and the hired men. She revealed enough that detectives could show she was communicating directly with criminals before the shooting. That link was all the case needed to move beyond speculation and into proof. The use of the Reed technique had done its work. Confronted with fake technology, false claims of evidence, and relentless pressure, Jennifer altered her answers until her story no longer resembled what she had told the 911 dispatcher. By the end of that third interview, detectives had drawn from her the admission they needed. She had been in contact with the people who carried out the attack. Whether she continued to insist the plan had gone wrong or was misdirected did not matter. What mattered was that she could no longer pose as an innocent. Investigators later supported their case with more than just Jennifer's words. They collected data from her phones, tracked her movements, and analyzed over 100 text messages she and Daniel Wong exchanged in the 6 hours leading up to the crime. These records aligned with the timeline of the invasion, showing coordination rather than coincidence. When combined with her changing story, the evidence created a clear picture. She was not a hostage saved by luck. She was a planner whose carefully staged scheme had unraveled. That final confession, however partial, marked the turning point. Police could now tie Jennifer Pan directly to the group of intruders. They had her voice, her words, and her devices, all showing involvement. The image of the grieving daughter phoning 911 was stripped away, replaced by the reality of a young woman orchestrating her parents' deaths. For detectives, it was the moment where theory became certainty. The case was no longer just about a suspicious 911 call or a miraculous survival. It was about a planned murder for hire, now confessed to by the daughter who claimed to be its victim. The hours in that interrogation room had turned her performance against her. What she revealed under pressure was more damaging than anything the police could have proven with physical evidence alone. By admitting her role, even with excuses, she had implicated herself in the one way she could not escape. From that point forward, there was no pretending Jennifer Pan was only a witness. The interrogation shifted her legal status, her public image, and her future. Once her words were recorded on that tape, she was tied to the crime in a way she could never undo. And when the case finally reached a courtroom, those admissions, stacked alongside phone records, testimony, and inconsistencies, would become the backbone of the prosecution's argument. What detectives pulled from Jennifer in that small room would later help the Crown secure convictions, not just against her, but against the men who carried out the attack. By the time jurors heard her shifting stories, her father's survival, and the pattern of messages leading to the shooting, public opinion turned fully against her. The interrogation had been the trap, and Jennifer herself had sprung it. Next, the trial would reveal the full scope of her lies, the careful construction of her double life, and the shock of the verdict that sealed her fate. In March 2014, Jennifer Pan walked into a courtroom in Newmarket, Ontario, charged with first-degree murder and attempted murder. Beside her sat Daniel Wong, David Mulvaganam, and Lenford Crawford. Each faced charges for their part in the carefully arranged home invasion that left Bichha Pan dead and Han Pan critically injured. The trial would run for 10 months and would take jurors through years of deception, layers of hidden detail, and hours of testimony designed to answer one central question. Was this the plan of intruders gone wild, or the outcome of a daughter's secret plot? The prosecution set the stage by laying out the world Jennifer built out of lies. They presented forged report cards, fake university letters, and evidence of the secret phones she used to manage her relationship with Daniel Wong. They reminded the court that her parents had lived strict and honest lives, while their daughter lived in an alternate version, appearing as the model child in one room, while plotting a different reality in another. These lies, they said, were not small escapes. They were a pattern that eventually allowed her to imagine the murder-for-hire plot. In a room filled with jurors, lawyers, and an audience that included reporters, the court heard about the late-night text messages exchanged between Jennifer and Daniel. Over 100 messages were sent in the hours leading up to the murder, and these became central to the Crown's argument. They looked less like casual notes between a couple and more like steps in a countdown. The prosecution linked the timing of these conversations directly to the night when 3 men came in through an unlocked door, bound Jennifer's parents, and carried out the attack she later claimed surprised her. The theme of money played an important role in the case. Prosecutors argued that the promise of inheritance was a clear motive for Jennifer's role in arranging the deaths. She expected to gain $500,000 over time, and $10,000 was offered up front to those who carried it out. The courtroom heard this was not an impulsive lashing out by a frustrated daughter, but a calculation that weighed financial security against her parents' lives. Jurors were also presented with digital evidence tracing her steps. Jennifer owned 2 phones, the one her parents knew about, and another kept hidden. Information from those devices helped prosecutors show intentional concealment. According to the Crown, this was not a panic decision but a carefully constructed series of choices that created plausible cover. The fake bindings on Jennifer, the unfinished ransacking of the home, and the fact that valuables were left behind were all described as features, not flaws, of the plan. Through testimony, the prosecution highlighted Han Pan's survival. Han gave his account of that night, telling the court that his daughter's behavior seemed different from what would be expected of a hostage. He explained that her parents were taped tightly and treated harshly. Jennifer was not. His account, that she whispered to one intruder in a friendly and soft manner, stood out to jurors, marking her role as something closer to collaborator than captive. The defense tried to establish doubt. They suggested Jennifer had no real intention of killing her parents, that her interactions with Daniel and others were the exaggerated words of a young woman overwhelmed by stress. Some of their arguments leaned on the idea that she never followed through on the decision, merely satisfied a fantasy with texts and conversations. But where the defense sought uncertainty, the prosecution pointed back to hard evidence. Actions taken before and during that night showed not distance from the act, but involvement in it. The media covered each phase of the trial in detail. Newspapers wrote about Jennifer's double life. Television crews waited outside the courthouse, and the case became widely discussed across Canada. Many within the Asian immigrant community followed with particular interest, as the strict household structure of the Pan family reflected a cultural experience familiar to them. For the broader public, it was the shock of a daughter planning violence against her own parents that gripped attention. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere grew heavy. As jurors were shown photographic evidence, they saw coroner images of bullet wounds, graphic displays of blood pooling in the family home, and heard testimony of the gunfire that killed Bitch in her basement. For many jurors, it was their first time exposed to such detail. The foreman, Patrick Fleming, later admitted the experience was lasting, that returning to normal life proved difficult, even after their work was done. Being sequestered for 4 days to deliberate only added to the strain, yet despite the emotional toll, jurors emerged with a clear decision. In December 2014, all 4 defendants, Jennifer Pan, Daniel Wong, David Milvaganam, and Lenford Crawford, were found guilty of first-degree murder and attempted murder. The mandatory sentence for first-degree murder in Canada is life in prison with no parole for 25 years, and each received that outcome. The courtroom, crowded with media and members of the community, absorbed the weight of the decision. For Han, who survived the attack, it confirmed legally what he had already known. His daughter had arranged for his death and her mother's murder. One co-conspirator, Eric Carty, had been separated from the main trial when illness struck his defense lawyer. Later, he admitted guilt for conspiracy to commit murder, agreeing to an 18-year sentence with eligibility for parole after 9 years. He would die in prison in 2018, still serving time. Years later, the case continued inside legal systems. In May 2023, the Court of Appeal for Ontario ruled that the original trial judge had improperly instructed the jury, limiting their options to only a first-degree murder verdict, rather than considering possibilities like second-degree murder or manslaughter. A new trial was ordered on the murder charges, though the attempted murder convictions for Han Pan were upheld. In April 2025, the Supreme Court of Canada upheld that decision with a 7-2 majority, agreeing that jurors should have had wider options when considering intent. For now, Jennifer and her accomplices face another trial, but their attempted murder sentences remain. The story that began with a stage-managed 911 call turned into one of the most closely followed trials in recent Canadian history. For years, the image of Jennifer Pan was debated: dutiful daughter, secret rebel, or manipulative criminal. But in the end, her fate was sealed, not by perception, but by verdict. She was sentenced to life in prison, not eligible for parole until she serves at least 25 years. Still, one question lingers over this case. How did the small lies of a teenager about grades, friends, and freedom grow into a plan that ended with her mother's murder and her father's permanent injury? That is the haunting question that remains. Hi again. Today's case comes from the heart of Russia, and it's one of the deadliest serial killer stories the country has ever seen. With more than 50 lives claimed, this is a dark chapter in true crime history that's as haunting as it is unbelievable. And before we start, comment down below where you are listening from and what time it is right now. Also press the like button and subscribe. Thanks. A woman goes for a walk in Moscow's Bitsa Park and never comes home. Within hours, police find her body, struck from behind, a vodka bottle forced into her skull. But what investigators uncover next is far more terrifying. This wasn't a random act. It was the work of a man who believed every killing was his next move in a twisted chess game. Who was he, and how did he manage to stay hidden for over a decade? It began as a normal day for Marina Moskalyova. She lived in Moscow, worked an ordinary job, and like many people, she often used the sprawling paths of Bitsa Park as a shortcut. The park was vast, stretching over 2,000 acres, with wooded trails, quiet streams, and secluded spots far from the city's main streets. On the evening she disappeared, she left work with a co-worker, heading toward the park. For her, it was meant to be nothing more than a simple walk home. That decision placed her on a path towards something no one expected. When Marina stepped into the park, the sun was already dipping low, which meant parts of the wooded area were blanketed in shade. Bitsa Park was known locally for its dense forested sections, and as daylight faded, those paths could seem almost deserted. That night, she did not make it back. Her family and colleagues noticed her absence quickly. They knew her routine and sensed something was wrong when she failed to return. The search for her began within hours, a community effort mixed with growing fear over what could have happened. Police officers were dispatched to the park, and their work soon came to a grim conclusion. Marina's body was discovered inside the wooded maze of Bitsa Park. What they found shocked even experienced investigators. She had been attacked with blunt force, struck repeatedly in the back of the head. The injuries were not random or frenzied. They were deliberate, repeated with intensity, and showed signs of planning. This was not a situation that escalated suddenly. It suggested the work of someone who had done this before, or who intended to do it again. The scene also revealed something investigators would come to recognize as a disturbing signature. Near the wounds in Marina's skull, they discovered a vodka bottle forced inside the injury itself. It was not a weapon of convenience. It was placed with calculated effort, almost as though the killer wanted to send a message or leave behind evidence of control. This detail stood out because it was both personal and grotesque. Moscow authorities quickly realized they were dealing with something far beyond an ordinary murder. Forensic investigators began piecing together details the scene provided. The blows to Marina's head had been delivered from behind, suggesting stealth and careful positioning. There were no immediate signs of theft. Her possessions were still on her, which ruled out robbery as a motive. The state of her body indicated that the attacker had gone to great lengths to assert dominance even after she was no longer alive. To the investigators, this showed a pattern more common with an organized offender rather than a spontaneous killer. A person who carefully planned what they wanted to do and who carried it out without remorse. The use of alcohol as a lure later became clear during the broader investigation. Many witnesses reported that people often saw loners in Bitzer Park, approached by strangers, offering vodka, companionship, or a game of chess. The bottle at Marina's murder scene was not just a weapon or a marker. It connected back to a strategy the killer used time and time again, both to lure victims and to leave behind his unmistakable calling card. Alcohol was both bait and signature. Neighbors of the park were shocked at the violence. At the time, Bitzer Park was a place families used, where pensioners took daily walks, and where chess enthusiasts gathered outdoors. The brutality of Marina's death changed the way people saw the park. Media outlets began reporting on her case almost immediately. Residents grew uneasy about going into the forested areas alone. What unsettled them most was the sheer cruelty. The idea that a person could not only kill, but attempt to control the narrative of death itself. Police reviewed Marina's injuries and compared them to past reports of unsolved killings in the area. It was not long before a wider picture came into focus. Although authorities did not release details immediately, internally they began to match patterns. Blunt trauma to the skull, rapid disposal of the victims in secluded sections of the park, and the recurring presence of items like bottles left at or inside the wounds. A killing like this one hinted strongly at the presence of a repeat offender. The act of placing the bottle within the wound suggested ritual and consistency rather than a single spontaneous crime. This discovery pushed detectives to comb through records of people missing near the park over the last decade. Soon enough, they uncovered unsolved cases of men, often older or marginalized, who were last seen walking into the park and never returned. Some bodies had been recovered from sewer drains flowing beneath the park's trails. Others had been reported missing, but their cases remained unresolved. The forensic evidence from Marina's killing provided the missing thread, linking all of these deaths together. For Marina's family, there was no comfort in these details. They had lost someone they loved in the cruelest way possible. But for investigators, her murder became the key that started unraveling the quiet cover under which a predator had been operating. Without this discovery, the killings might have carried on unnoticed for much longer. Because of her case, the pattern was brought into the open, where the police could no longer dismiss earlier vanishings as isolated accidents. The brutality of her attack demonstrated something chilling. Whoever was behind it needed more than killing alone. The staging of the crime scene showed a craving for spectacle. To force an object inside the wound was not something done on impulse. It took time and intent. That meant the killer was not satisfied with ending the life of his victim. He wanted power displayed beyond death. For investigators, this suggested a killer escalating in confidence, someone who could no longer resist the urge to announce his presence through violence. Although Marina's case horrified the community, it also served as a wake-up call for the authorities. The press began to report that a predator might be at work in Moscow, targeting people within the park itself. Unease spread. People began taking alternate routes, avoiding the woods at night, or traveling only in groups. Still, for police, the question remained, who could carry out crimes with such deliberate cruelty? And how long had he been doing it? The killing of Marina Moskalyova was not the beginning, though it became the moment the public became aware. For Moscow authorities, the scene signaled that they were not dealing with an isolated incident. It was the evidence of something far larger, a violent campaign hidden beneath ordinary life in the capital. To understand how one man could reach that point, hidden, calculating, and able to kill repeatedly, investigators had to trace his life back many years. This trail led not just through the park, but into his beginnings, where the first cracks in his personality had already started to form. But to understand how he got here, we have to go back. Could a childhood accident rewire a future killer? For Alexander Pichushkin, many point to one incident in particular. As a young boy in Moscow, he suffered a serious head injury at a playground. He had been playing when a heavy swing struck him squarely in the head, hard enough to damage the frontal cortex of his brain. This region, now widely known for governing judgment, self-control, and decision-making, was where doctors later suspected the trauma had left lasting effects. Although at the time it might not have seemed like more than a playground mishap, the injury would shadow his development in ways no one could have predicted. Before the accident, Alexander was described as ordinary, even sociable. He played with other children, sought their company, and blended easily in groups. Afterward, his behavior began to change. Teachers and relatives started noticing mood swings and sudden outbursts of anger. Small provocations brought on big reactions. The boy who had once been easygoing now appeared unpredictable. Experts who studied his case later suggested that the blow might have damaged the exact part of the brain associated with impulse control, meaning frustrations that most kids could shrug off were no longer manageable for him. School made things worse. Other students began to tease him, sometimes cruelly. He struggled with speech at times, and classmates latched onto anything that set him apart. In the rigid environment of the Soviet classroom, bullying could be relentless. Alexander often found himself alienated, feeling cornered by those around him. Instead of reaching out for friendships, he retreated. He became more solitary, finding refuge not in people, but in personal escapes. The tug between wanting acceptance and facing constant rejection only seemed to increase his frustration. Those humiliations, paired with his volatile temper, created an isolated child who looked for order elsewhere. That order arrived through his grandfather. Unlike many others in his life, the older man recognized potential in Alexander and encouraged him. He introduced him to chess, a game already deeply ingrained in Russian culture. For the boy, chess became more than a pastime. It became an arena where control, strategy, and intellect could triumph. Each game was a chance not only to learn moves, but to escape the petty cruelties of school life. At the chessboard, the mocking voices of classmates did not exist. What mattered was foresight, patience, and the ability to think steps ahead. His grandfather, seeing this, urged him to pursue the game with dedication. Chess soon became a growing obsession. Alexander often spent long hours studying strategies, memorizing openings, and imagining himself mastering opponents. Some reports note that he displayed significant ability early on, showing an almost obsessive desire to study and replay matches until every possible move became familiar. The grid of 64 squares offered him control and predictability that were absent in his daily life. In a sense, the game became both a shield and a structure. While he lacked real connection with peers, the game of chess gave him an outlet that made him feel powerful, smart, and in command of outcomes. But even this lifeline would not last. Alexander's grandfather eventually passed away, leaving him without the one stable influence who had treated him with encouragement and respect. This loss hit him harder than most expected, taking away the man who had not only introduced him to chess, but also given him a sense of belonging. Without that support, the game remained, but the comfort behind it was gone. Chess transformed from a hobby, guided by companionship, into something darker, more solitary. He carried on with the same obsession, but now it operated in a vacuum of grief and detachment. During adolescence, his volatility grew. The combination of neurological injury, continued bullying, and the absence of his grandfather's guidance made him even more unstable. Teachers saw behavioral issues that set him apart from other teens. He became prone to aggression and sought dominance where he could. He wanted control that eluded him in daily life. The pressure of his isolation, amplified by internal confusion, started to eat away at the thin layer of normality he had managed to maintain. The very game that had once offered refuge became a symbolic platform for his rising fixation on control, victory, and superiority over others. Psychologists who later studied his case often pointed to this period as crucial. The frontal cortex injury alone might not explain his outcome, but combined with social rejection and the loss of someone who anchored him, it created ingredients for distortion. A child who once needed stability lacked it. A boy once cheered on for simple moves on a chessboard lost the encouragement that made him feel significant. In that vacuum, frustration fermented. Instead of learning normal pathways of empathy and companionship, he began associating satisfaction with power, with the ability to dominate through tactics. The unfolding years showed a fragile young man who could no longer process emotions as others did. Each insult at school hit harder. Each loss of approval deepened his sense of alienation. At the same time, chess reinforced notions of winning by eliminating opposition. His love for the structured game, combined with a brain unable to regulate impulses, pushed him further from healthy bonds. Losing his grandfather stripped away the one figure who had nurtured him in a constructive direction. Left alone, the obsession mutated, feeding frustrations and skewing his perception of relationships. While many children face bullying and loss, Pichushkin's case carried with it the added weight of a brain injury that left him less able to handle stress in healthy ways. Experts later compared such injuries to removing the brakes from a car. Emotions, impulses, and desires rolled forward unchecked. Coupled with ridicule at school, his mind absorbed rejection more deeply. Without guidance, he sought control over the small things he could, replaying chess moves or imagining outcomes where he always had the upper hand. This spiral laid the groundwork for the patterns that would appear later. From the outside, he appeared fragile, unstable, and increasingly angry. To those who cared to look closely, there were clear markers of a teenager being pushed toward darker impulses. The swing accident had left its mark on his brain. The bullying left scars on his sense of worth. The death of his grandfather stripped away the one bond that had kept him tethered. What remained was a young man with unstable emotions, obsessed with a game where destroying an opponent was the end goal, and unable to find belonging outside that rigid grid of black and white squares. But signs of his cruelty appeared long before his first murder. The chilling videos no teenager should ever make began in Alexander Pichushkin's adolescence. Unlike most young people who might record family events or time with friends, his tapes captured something far more disturbing. He pointed the camera at acts that revealed his early fascination with fear. One of the most telling incidents involved children from his neighborhood. Alexander would hold them upside down outside of high apartment windows, their small bodies dangling over a fatal drop as he gripped their ankles with his hands. Looking straight into the lens, he would declare that their lives were in his hands. For the neighborhood kids, it was a terrifying experience, a moment of helplessness with no idea if he would let go. To those who later studied the tapes, it demonstrated more than cruelty. It revealed a teenager rehearsing the role of executioner, savoring the control and the ability to decide if another person lived or fell to their death. This was not just reckless bravado caught on camera, it was the beginning of a pattern where domination itself was the prize. After making these recordings, Alexander returned to them again and again. Friends later recalled how he enjoyed replaying the tapes, studying his own performance, and reliving that sense of power. Watching himself issue life or death threats became a ritual. The more he observed it, the more he reinforced the belief that control over others could provide satisfaction. These were not home videos tucked away as memories. They were rehearsals kept alive by repeated viewings, strengthening the link in his mind between authority and gratification. The young Pichushkin showed little interest in companionship outside of these experiments in dominance. While most teenagers longed for approval or acceptance among peers, for him satisfaction came when others were terrified. By returning to the tapes instead of socializing, he revealed his priorities. He was less interested in being liked and more fascinated with being feared. This reversal of the usual social desire, trading bonds for intimidation, highlighted just how different his development had become. In Pichushkin's neighborhood, these behaviors occurred without widespread notice. He had outward hobbies that provided a facade of normalcy. One of the most visible was his continued obsession with chess. To outsiders, a young man carrying a board or playing in the park seemed harmless, even studious. Parents might have approved, teachers might have encouraged him to keep his mind active, and peers sometimes looked on with mild curiosity. Chess, however, concealed his darker side. The discipline and planning required for the game merged with the intensity of his hidden recordings. He cultivated the appearance of an ordinary pastime while pursuing sinister experiments in private. The tapes also showed that his enjoyment came from the process rather than from any friendship with those present. In one sense, the children he dangled above the ground served as props. Their terror, shaking limbs, and screams became elements of his performance. He did not need them as companions after the fact. What mattered most was the temporary state of absolute power, followed by the record that allowed him to relive it. The unchanged repetition of viewing and reviewing his acts strengthened his attachment to fear as a kind of fuel. Experts who later reviewed his background often highlighted these videos as early indicators of an escalating cycle. A teenager who relies on fear for entertainment and control may seek ever more intense ways of gaining it. In replaying a simulated choice of life or death, Pichushkin was preparing himself for situations where the choice would become real. The camera gave him not just an outlet but also proof. It captured him in command, an image frozen in time that reinforced the way he wanted to see himself. What these incidents also revealed was an unresolved hunger for dominance over helplessness. His own childhood, marked by bullying, left him humiliated and weak in front of classmates who laughed at him. With a camera in his hand and terrified children beneath him, he reversed that humiliation. Now others trembled while he decided their fate. The tapes became a mirror where he could watch himself as something more powerful than the defenseless boy who had endured taunts in school. In doing so, he crafted a personal narrative, where fear was the answer to his own inadequacy. The unsettling pattern was clear to anyone who could see past the surface. Instead of processing rejection through resilience, he turned it into aggression. Instead of rebuilding self-confidence through achievement, he rebuilt it through domination. These recordings made private what would one day become his public crimes. The enjoyment he found in orchestrating fear was too deeply embedded to remain contained. In truth, every playback carried him closer to testing the same power outside of performance. It is important to note that many who knew him were still unaware of these disturbing practices. To casual acquaintances, a teenager studying chess strategies in his spare time or passing through the neighborhood with a board looked unremarkable. Some described him as quiet, perhaps awkward, but hardly dangerous. The tapes were known only to a handful of peers, if at all. Lacking context, adults saw only the veneer of a boy with unusual enthusiasm for a traditional game. This gap between perception and reality created an environment where his unusual behavior advanced, unchecked. The notion that fear could be filmed, replayed, and used for personal gratification became one of Pichushkin's earliest rehearsals for violence. Every time he rewound the images, he strengthened the association between dominance and personal satisfaction. Over time, the powerless faces of his young neighbors acted like silent encouragement to continue pushing boundaries. Without anyone intervening, his rehearsal grew more advanced. The stage of the window ledge, the uneven balance of child bodies dangling over the drop, and the voice declaring control over life and death, all of these were steps along a path toward actual killing. When investigators later examined his developmental history, these recordings offered a chilling window into how deeply his fixation on control had taken root, long before his first known murder. They showed a youth not experimenting with harmless rebellion but staging entire scenes where the ultimate power over others was his to command. For most teenagers, videotapes were souvenirs of nights spent with friends. For him, they were stark reminders of domination replayed endlessly, etched into memory as victories. The significance of these tapes has grown over time as psychologists continue to study them. They reveal how fantasy and performance can become practice. By coupling control with pleasure and fear with satisfaction, Pichushkin rehearsed the mindset of a predator years before the first life was ended in reality. In those moments, the rehearsals blurred into something more than fantasy. They became training. The obsession with power became a disturbing rehearsal for murder. Soon, fantasy turned into action with his first victim. His first plan already had 64 deaths in mind. Alexander Pichushkin was still a teenager when he revealed this plan to a classmate named Mikhail Oditchuk. The two boys were close enough to confide in one another, yet the friendship carried a darker edge. Unlike other schoolyard conversations, theirs did not focus on music or sports. Instead, Alexander spoke of murder as if it was a strategy, a contest to be drawn out across years. The idea was simple in his mind. Each square of a chessboard would represent a victim. 64 squares, 64 murders. At first, Mikhail treated these claims as wild, even theatrical. But over time, the words took root, and together the two boys began to plan the unthinkable. By the time they were both old enough to act on these fantasies, their conversations had crossed a line. This was not just theory anymore. Alexander invited his classmate to help him turn those ideas into reality. At first, Mikhail seemed willing, perhaps caught between curiosity and loyalty to his strange friend. The plan was direct. They would lure someone they knew into Bitsa Park, an area already familiar to both of them. The secluded entrances and underground sewer tunnels provided privacy. The park's size made it easy to disappear into, and at the edge of Moscow, it was known both as a place for leisure and a location to drink with little attention from police. For Alexander, it was the perfect ground to stage what he saw as his opening move. When the night finally arrived, the boys set the plan in motion. They met at Bitsa Park, carrying the tension of an idea about to become reality. Alexander urged Mikhail to act with him, yet it was in that moment that Mikhail faltered. Faced with the prospect of actually taking another life, he backed out. Fear, hesitation, or perhaps the sudden weight of conscience stopped him cold. For most, this would have been the end. Few people would carry a shallow teenage threat beyond angry words. But Alexander was different. To him, backing out meant betrayal, and betrayal carried consequences. According to accounts reconstructed later, the refusal only solidified Mikhail's fate. That friendship, once twisted around a shared plan, now became the justification for murder. The betrayal was too much for Alexander's pride, and in a grim reversal, his first victim became the very peer who was supposed to be his accomplice. After luring him into the park, Alexander attacked. Strangulation was the method. It was efficient, silent, and brutal. Once Mikhail's body was limp, Alexander dragged him to the opening of an underground sewer tunnel. The park contained multiple shafts leading down into the water systems beneath Moscow. He left Mikhail's body there, hidden from casual discovery. That decision had lasting consequences for investigators. Without a body located, the crime remained officially unsolved. The absence of physical evidence made prosecution nearly impossible at the time. Alexander was briefly considered a suspect when Mikhail disappeared. After all, suspicion naturally landed on the friend last seen with him. For a short period, Pichushkin was under police scrutiny, and he was even taken into custody. But without a corpse or witnesses, detectives could not establish a case that would stand in court. The authorities released him, and the incident faded into the background of Moscow's case files. For Mikhail's family, there would never be the closure of a burial. He remained missing, lost to a tunnel beneath the very park that would later hold so many more victims. For Alexander, though, this was more than just the killing of a friend. It was a beginning. The first square on his imagined chessboard had been taken, and the sense of power he had long rehearsed in his tapes was now tested against real life. There was no turning away, no undoing the act. Unlike childhood games of bluff or theatrics with other kids, this was irreversible. The pattern he had planned in his head was no longer a fantasy. It had begun with the person who had stumbled at the edge of the plan. The remarkable detail of this moment is not just the murder itself, but the missed opportunity for intervention. That first killing could have led to a tighter investigation, a grave discovery, and the end of his career before it truly started. But the lack of evidence opened the way for years of silence. For police, there was no proof of a crime at all. Mikhail appeared to have vanished. Authorities held suspicions, but suspicions are not facts, and without a body or confession, the system let Alexander walk free. This failure to act decisively would haunt the record later, as the full scope of his crimes came to light. For the next several years, Alexander Pichushkin lived under a kind of self-imposed quiet. He did not announce more killings immediately, at least none that could be proven. It was as if the murder of Mikhail satisfied his rage for a time, or perhaps confirmed his willingness to wait until circumstances aligned again. During this pause, the urge did not disappear. His own writings and later confessions showed that he always thought in terms of strategy, biding his time as though each crime required its place. The silence was deceptive. To the outside world, it looked like nothing at all. But beneath that calm exterior, the violence was only resting, waiting for the chance to rise again. Looking back, the murder of Mikhail Odichuk stands as a critical turning point. This was not a stranger selected randomly. This was a boy he knew, a boy who shared his classes, his walks, and his time. It revealed how little hesitation Alexander felt in targeting someone close to him. The act showed that loyalty, trust, or familiarity were meaningless. Once someone failed to meet his demands, they became expendable. This disregard set the tone for later crimes, where proximity and acquaintance offered no protection. In his worldview, betrayal deserved punishment, and punishment meant elimination. Despite its invisibility to the public at the time, this killing fit perfectly within the outline of the chessboard fantasy. It served as the opening move, the first capture on a board he intended to fill. Even though investigators did not see the pattern yet, in Alexander's mind, the pieces were already in motion. Each victim, each act of violence, would simply follow from the logic he set that night. The significance of choosing Mikhail as the first extended beyond revenge. It trained him to treat killing as achievable, something he could commit and conceal. He saw clarity in the outcome. He could end a life, avoid detection, and walk away untouched. That clarity emboldened him. The tragedy of Mikhail's death is not just that it was his friend who suffered. It is also in what it prevented. If charges had been made, if evidence had been conclusive, dozens of lives later might have been spared. The silence following that crime was not peace, but delay. And when the urge returned, Alexander brought it with greater calculation than before. The seeds of his long career as a murderer were already planted in the soil of Bitsa Park, and the roots were spreading. His first victim, the friend who had once shared the idea, then refused to act, sealed a deadly pattern. Pichushkin's betrayal of his accomplice set in motion a journey Moscow police would take years to uncover. For the public, it seemed as though the case of Mikhail Odichuk was just another disappearance. For Alexander, it was the start of his imagined game. For years after, he went silent, but the violence was only dormant, preparing for a brutal return. After almost a decade of silence, the bodies began reappearing. When authorities looked back, they would see that the killings in Bitsa Park were not a sudden outbreak, but a carefully controlled return. By the early 2000s, Alexander Pichushkin decided that the long pause after his first murder had gone on long enough. The same forest trails, the same underground sewer tunnels, and the same sense of isolation that hid his first crime now became the stage for dozens more. Once again, Moscow's sprawling parkland, so familiar to families, chess players, and elderly residents, turned into hunting grounds, and this time the scale was far greater. His focus in these early years fell on those society often overlooked. Elderly pensioners, many of them homeless or socially isolated, became his primary targets. Some of these men came into the park in search of a quiet space to drink, and others wandered there because they had little else. Alexander approached them with simple offers: a bottle of vodka, a shared conversation, even a quick game of chess. For his victims, there was no reason to think a stranger offering companionship posed a threat. If anything, he blended into the regular park culture, where chessboards and drinks were part of everyday life. Once a victim agreed to join him, his methods rarely changed. The first strike came from behind. He often used a hammer, chosen because it could fit into a pocket and leave little mess on his own clothing. On other occasions, he relied on vodka bottles, turning them from bait into weapons. Once the victim collapsed, he almost always finished the act by dragging the body to sewer openings scattered throughout the park. These narrow shafts, leading to streams underneath, became his favoured disposal sites. The sewers hid evidence quickly, and police soon noticed how many bodies were recovered along the park's waterways. To Alexander, this method provided efficiency and concealment. As the killings progressed, the brutality escalated. He wasn't content with simply bludgeoning his victims. When police arrived at some of the later scenes, they discovered horrifying details. Wooden sticks driven through the skull, bottles rammed into the wounds with deliberate force. These were not quick killings or sloppy cover-ups. They were staged in a way that ensured investigators would recognize them as intentional and symbolic acts. The repetition of these grotesque markers soon became recognizable as his calling card. What had begun years earlier with the murder of his classmate was now transformed into ritual. During the same period, Bitsa Park remained part of ordinary Moscow life. Families still used its open fields on weekends. Children played on the same swings and climbing frames that filled public playgrounds across the city. Pensioners met at benches to play chess. Yet, within walking distance of those activities, bodies accumulated in drainage canals and wooded clearings. The imagery was striking. What appeared to be a place of leisure by day had, without public knowledge, turned into a graveyard. The contrasts made the crimes more unsettling. While dog walkers strolled paths overhead, the remains of victims were hidden in sewers below. Not every attack ended with death. Several people survived their encounters with Alexander. One such survivor later explained how a seemingly friendly man offered him vodka on a warm afternoon, only to strike his head from behind without warning. Staggering and bleeding, the victim managed to escape before being dragged off. Though injured, these survivors carried important clues. They confirmed that the attacker often used blunt force, and that he was willing to exploit the trust of anyone who agreed to sit down with him. What stood out was how their accounts aligned across different incidents, painting a picture of a consistent predator. Even with this testimony, however, tying all of the attacks back to one man proved difficult. The police at the time struggled to see the connection between the crimes. One reason was the diversity of victims. Many were marginalized figures, men with no fixed address or estranged from families, which meant their disappearances often went unreported for days or even weeks. That delay gave Alexander time to continue without pressure. Another complication was the sheer size of Bitsa Park, covering more than 2,000 acres. Its mixture of woods, streams, and tunnels created hiding places that made consistent oversight impossible. Without direct evidence linking cases, authorities initially treated the murders as isolated events, crimes of opportunity in a city already dealing with high levels of violence. To Alexander, each success reinforced the idea that he could continue unchecked. Each body placed in the sewers became another claimed square on his mental chessboard. Unlike the first killing of his classmate, where he hesitated for years afterward, this new campaign came with no long pauses. Once he started, he continued steadily. The sewers period, as it would later be called, stretched across the early 2000s and claimed dozens of lives. Estimates differ, but law enforcement later suspected the real count far exceeded the number he was convicted for. What mattered to him was not the official number but the ritual itself, an outward expression of control that he repeated again and again. The choice of the sewer drains as his disposal method also spoke to his understanding of the environment. Beneath the park ran more than just water. These tunnels connected to the infrastructure of Moscow itself, making them both accessible and difficult to patrol. By using them, he ensured that discovery would often happen long after the killing. When investigators did recover remains, decomposition and water damage erased vital forensic details. The system, already stretched thin, lacked the resources to unite these disjointed discoveries into a single investigation. For Alexander, the drains were perfect, discrete open mouths, ready to swallow evidence whole. Over the course of these years, fear spread in local whispers. Residents near the park noticed an unusual number of police patrols, yet few knew the reason. Some who were aware of the danger still dismissed it as sensational rumor, unwilling to believe that dozens of people could vanish so close to home. The park's daytime appearance as a safe public space covered the reality of its hidden role as a graveyard. In fact, that everyday normalcy may have protected him as much as his tactics did. So long as chessboards and families appeared in the park, the darker truth remained invisible to most. By the time authorities realized that clustering deaths pointed to something coordinated, Alexander's count had already soared. His acts displayed more consistency, more ritual. The hammer, the bottle, the sewer drains, and the grotesque post-mortem staging all pointed to a predator seeking not just to end lives, but to send messages. Though investigators would only fully grasp the scope later, the pattern was solidified. Bitzer Park, once known for picnics and weekend games, was by then almost a private hunting ground for a man who thought each victim was a move forward on his imagined chessboard. This period left a horrifying legacy. The survivors' testimonies, the dozens of missing, and the repeated discoveries of battered bodies eventually forced police to confront the possibility of an organized serial killer operating within Moscow. Yet at the time, connections came too slowly. That delay gave him freedom. The sewers period marked his transformation from hesitant teenage killer into a practiced predator. Alexander had not only resumed killing, he had refined it into a precise ritual of bait, strike, and disposal. He was no longer content to hide among the shadows. His methods grew clearer with every crime, but his methods would grow even more brutal. The killer turned from strangers to his own neighbors. For years, Alexander Pichushkin had prowled the woods of Bitzer Park, looking for men who were off the radar, homeless wanderers, old pensioners, people who would not be missed right away. But by 2005, that changed. The murders moved into what investigators later called the open period, spanning from late 2005 into the summer of 2006. It was during this time that the brutality of his attacks deepened and the targets shifted uncomfortably close to his own home. For the first time, neighbors in the very apartment blocks where he lived became his victims. The change in method was immediate and striking. He now bludgeoned his victims over and over again, most often with a hammer. The repeated blows left wounds that made identification difficult and ensured death even if the first strike did not succeed. But what set these killings apart was not only the violence, but the ritual that followed. Pichushkin inserted a vodka bottle directly into the skull wound, pushing it with deliberate force. For investigators, this was not just mutilation. It was a calculated act that transformed the scene into something symbolic. The gesture told them the murder itself was no longer enough. The statement made afterward became just as important to him as the life he had taken. Attacking from behind became his standard tactic in this period. This choice was less about chance and more about preservation. Striking from behind allowed him to keep his clothing clean, avoiding the splatter that might have stained his jacket or pants if he faced the victim directly. That detail mattered because it showed he was not acting in reckless passion. He thought ahead about how to escape, how to lower the risks of leaving obvious evidence on himself, and how to maintain control even beyond the killing. Such a precaution pointed to a man balancing brutality with method, reinforcing the sense of an offender who knew exactly what he was doing. Perhaps the most unnerving detail was where these crimes began to occur. 10 of his known victims during the open period lived in the same apartment complex where he himself resided, on Khersonskaya Street in Moscow. These were not strangers met in hidden corners of a park. These were men and women who lived in close proximity, people who would have seen him in stairwells, courtyards, or grocery shops. The idea that residents passed him daily, never knowing that he was plotting to kill people within the same blocks, added a chilling intimacy to this phase of his crimes. Imagine living in an apartment building where your neighbor smiled in the hallway, slipped past you in the stairwell, and carried groceries through the same doors while secretly staging murders nearby. That was the reality on Khersonskaya Street. The neighbors never suspected that one of their own was dragging acquaintances into wooded patches and bludgeoning them with hammers. Some victims were invited under ordinary pretenses, only to be led out and eliminated in the same way as his earlier targets. There was no warning sign for those who lived closest to him. The proximity of his crimes to his home signaled more than convenience. Criminologists who studied the case pointed out that serial offenders often begin with victims far away, then gradually draw closer as their confidence grows. By this phase, Alexander was emboldened. Killing near home reflected not only his faith in his ability to evade detection, but also the collapse of any inhibitions he may once have had. He had moved past the need for distance. Now he was willing to strike within walking distance of where he slept every night. This new intimacy also reflected a shift in compulsion. Killing was no longer simply about eliminating a victim. It was about staging a ritual. The insertion of vodka bottles was repeated across cases, not just once or twice. Each killing became less about practical concealment and more about reinforcing a routine he could control. The ritual itself grew to carry as much meaning as the act of murder. For Pichushkin, domination did not end when life left the body. The deliberate bottle insertion made sure his power stretched beyond death. It was his mark, one the authorities could not ignore. The repeated blows to the head also spoke to this transition. Unlike earlier killings where a single strike might suffice, the pounding he unleashed during this time suggested excess. He wanted certainty, but also spectacle. Investigators later noted that the excessive hammer strikes went beyond necessity. They pointed to rage interlocked with ritual. Each swing amplified not only the death, but the reinforcement of his control. Victims were depersonalized, turned into objects for him to use as proof of his dominance. The bodies themselves became evidence of a performance his victims had no choice in. The neighbors on Khersonskaya remained unaware of what was happening until after his arrest. They described him in later interviews as quiet, someone who kept to himself, even helpful at times. They had no idea 10 of their own community were taken in just months. This gap between what they saw and what was actually happening behind the facade revealed another layer of his escalation. He felt so confident that he could carry on killing, while exchanging everyday pleasantries with those around him. That confidence, however, came with overreach. It blinded him to the risks. By June of 2006, the open period had made his pattern too distinctive to ignore. Authorities already suspected that the hammer attacks paired with bottles signaled a single offender. 10 victims from his home complex tied the crimes together in a way that would later help investigators close in on him. In trying to prove his power through ritual, he had left a lasting imprint that mapped his actions more clearly than ever before. His willingness to kill so close to home became, ironically, the very overconfidence that exposed him in the end. This phase captured the unsettling evolution of Alexander Pichushkin. From random wanderers in the shadows of Bitsa Park, he had now turned to neighbors who passed his door each day. He had escalated his force, invented a ritual, and crossed the boundary between his private residence and his public hunting grounds. His killings had become intimate, personal, and filled with signs of his arrogance. What once was hidden had begun to creep into his daily life. But his confidence soon caused a fatal mistake. In the end, it was a single scrap of paper that betrayed him. For years, Alexander Pichushkin had killed in shadows and hidden his victims in the ground and sewers of Bitsa Park, careful to cover his trails. But with the death of Marina Moskalyova, his carefully controlled system began to crack. One small item she carried with her before her final walk would unravel everything. In her purse at the time of her death was a metro ticket. That ticket, stamped with the date and station, became the cornerstone that investigators used to link her movements directly to him. Marina had done something else before heading into Bitsa Park that night. She left a note for her family, telling them where she was going and mentioning Alexander by name. At the time, it was a small detail, almost casual, but it gave police a lead earlier victims never had. Most of those who died in the park were isolated or socially disconnected. Marina, however, had family who noticed her absence quickly and had evidence of her last steps. Her note mattered. When combined with the metro ticket, it provided a trail that could be followed. Investigators traced that stamp on the ticket back into the Moscow metro network. At each station, surveillance cameras recorded streams of passengers moving through hallways and platforms. It was not easy work. Hours of footage had to be combed through, frame by frame. But when police spotted Marina's image, walking alongside Pichushkin on camera, it changed everything. The video showed them together, entering the metro, confirming they had travelled side by side, hours before her death. This was the first direct evidence linking him to a victim so close to the time of her murder. For police, it was a breakthrough. Up until that point, much of the evidence was circumstantial. Bitsa Park was vast, with many disappearances that could not easily be tied together. The Hammer killings had a pattern, but without eyewitnesses or conclusive proof, files stayed open with little progress. Marina's ticket changed all that. Now they had documentation. Her note, her ticket, and her image alongside Pichushkin. Investigators could point to more than rumors or coincidences. They had solid evidence placing him at her side shortly before she was killed. When Marina's body was recovered in the park, her injuries left little doubt about who was responsible. The blows to her skull, the impact marks from behind, and the unmistakable insertion of a vodka bottle were all consistent with the established pattern. Forensic specialists confirmed that these injuries matched the same method seen in earlier deaths. To detectives, this connection meant only one thing. They were not dealing with separate crimes. This was the work of the same man, and Marina's metro ticket confirmed his identity. Once enough evidence stacked up, police moved in to arrest him. He did not resist. Taken into custody, Alexander Pichushkin faced hours of interrogation. What followed stunned even experienced investigators. Instead of denial or evasive claims, he began to speak. He described the murders not only in detail but in sequence, walking officers through the events like a man turning pages of a diary. His memory of the victims was remarkable. He recalled how they looked, what they wore, where they fell, and how he disposed of them. It was as if each crime had been burned into his mind. Under Russian procedure, it is common to conduct crime scene reenactments, where suspects recount events in the presence of investigators and camera crews. Pichushkin participated willingly. He walked with officers back into Bitsa Park and retraced his crimes. On tape, he showed how he approached his victims, how he struck them, and how he dragged their bodies toward the sewer shafts. These demonstrations were chilling, not because of drama, but because of how matter-of-fact he appeared. He displayed no visible shame or hesitation in explaining how the victims were killed. Investigators noted how he described each victim as though he were replaying a chess game. He did not falter when recalling movements, directions, or methods. He could account for bodies left in shafts years earlier, as if he had committed the act only days before. To those watching, it was clear that this was not someone who stumbled through impulses. He remembered his crimes because, to him, they were structured events, each like a move on the board he imagined for himself. The level of detail provided credibility to his claims. While not all of the bodies he spoke about could be recovered or confirmed, the knowledge he held of places and methods matched evidence already on record. In some cases, he directed police to remains that had been overlooked. Each discovery reinforced that his words were not empty exaggerations. He had indeed killed many of those he claimed. His participation in the reenactments, filmed and preserved in the official record, gave prosecutors clear material to present later during trial. As the interrogations continued, police realized they had finally cornered the man who had eluded them for more than 14 years. The killings in Bitsa Park had masked themselves among unsolved disappearances, but Marina Moskalyova's murder exposed the hidden predator. Her metro ticket, a simple scrap of paper, led police step by step toward the truth. Combined with the forensic consistency in her injuries and the clear video evidence, the case was airtight. This time, there would be no release for lack of evidence. The impact of his arrest went beyond the immediate investigation. The scope of the murders he described forced the public and law enforcement alike to confront how one man had operated under their noses for so long. Each square on his imagined chessboard represented another life, and many of those squares had already been filled. Now, with him in custody, investigators could finally put the fragmented pieces together and shape a full picture. His openness in describing his crimes raised more chilling questions. What drove him to remember every detail so clearly? Why did each victim seem like a record to him rather than a tragedy? The answers to those questions emerged in his later confessions, when he explained what killing meant to him personally and why he compared himself to a god deciding life and death. But his own words were perhaps even more disturbing. What drove him to keep killing, again and again? That was the question raised once Alexander Pichushkin sat in custody and began to talk. For law enforcement, the details he described were beyond anything they expected. The scale shocked them, but it was his reasoning that left the strongest impression. He claimed that every killing gave him something essential, something that he could not obtain in any other way. In his own words, he explained, "In all cases I killed for only one reason. I killed in order to live, because when you kill, you want to live." For him, the act of ending another person's life was not simply destruction, it became an act tied to his own survival. His statements to investigators pulled the curtain back on how he saw himself. Life, for him, was inseparable from murder. "For me, life without murder is like life without food for you," he said. He framed the killings as nourishment, as routine as eating, a need rather than a choice. To him, victims were not people with their own families and experiences. He reduced them to necessary pieces in a distorted process that he claimed sustained him. When he described his role, he used language of control and guardianship, even stating that he felt like the father of all these people, since it was me who opened the door for them to another world. The phrase revealed how far removed he was from empathy. He imagined himself as a provider of passage, elevating himself to a position of power nobody could question. Alongside these statements came his explanation of the chessboard. From the beginning, he tied his killings to the grid of 64 squares. Each murder, in his mind, filled a space. It turned what would otherwise be random violence into a calculation. This goal of aligning his acts with a board game reflected not just planning, but a desire for order. With 64 slots to complete, he saw murder as a structured challenge, a project to complete rather than a crime spree without direction. Law enforcement pointed out that the metaphor suited his personality. The game he once clung to in childhood had become a framework for murder, but he later contradicted himself, saying the board was only one part of the truth. During questioning, he admitted that 64 was not a limit after all. He told investigators that if not stopped, he would have continued killing indefinitely. His chess plan, as chilling as it sounded, was only a symbolic stage in the larger pursuit. This recantation made clear that he saw no natural endpoint. The killings were not constrained by the idea of a completed game or a fixed tally. Instead, they were an open-ended effort, with the only control being his own arrest. The acknowledgement reinforced just how deeply the act had fused with his identity. The public was disturbed not only by his crimes but by his self-image. In his mind, every attack placed him above the ordinary world. He equated himself to a god deciding who lived and who died. The investigators heard him describe his role in grandiose terms, as if he oversaw the boundary between life and death. This sense of supremacy is often noted in profiles of power-driven offenders. They find satisfaction not only in the act itself, but in the belief that they alone hold the authority to decide another's fate. Pichushkin could not have stated this more clearly. As news of his confessions spread in Russia, the media quickly drew comparisons to earlier cases. The most frequent name raised was Andrei Chikatilo, known as one of the most notorious killers of the Soviet Union. The similarity of large body counts, the brutality of crimes, and the focus on vulnerable victims made the link inescapable for journalists. Reports presented Pichushkin as a successor to that earlier figure, framing him as the next chapter in a grim narrative of Russian true crime. This comparison helped the public grasp the magnitude of his actions, but it also shaped how Alexander may have seen himself. Being named alongside Chikatilo turned him into part of a national story, and the attention meant his claims of significance were being amplified rather than ignored. Psychologists examining his case emphasized the role of control in his confessions. They noted that his statements reflected not only a craving for dominance, but also an effort to correct feelings of weakness he experienced earlier in life. The childhood brain injury, the bullying, and the rejection combined to leave him powerless. His killings became a way to swing that balance sharply in the other direction. By deciding over life and death, he placed himself at the peak of authority. Each confession he gave reiterated this need. He wanted the world to see just how precisely he remembered every detail, as if recounting moves in a match. Courts and media audiences alike saw how his recollections turned lives into statistics. But for him, they were badges of mastery. The contradictions in his explanations made him even more unsettling. On one hand, he insisted he had a clear vision, a structured aim tied to chess. On the other, he admitted that there would never have been an end, no finish line he would be content with. This tension suggested that the chessboard was never the true goal, only a flexible narrative. It gave reporters and authorities an image to attach to him, but in reality, the compulsion would have stretched far beyond that. His words proved as manipulative as the lures he offered his victims. He enjoyed constructing metaphors that elevated him, but beneath them lay the raw drive to kill again and again. When confronted with these accounts, the response from the wider public carried layers of outrage and disbelief. Many could not comprehend how someone could link nourishment to violence, or how he framed himself as a parental figure, sending others into another world. To ordinary citizens, it was repulsion. For psychologists, however, it laid bare the workings of someone with an unrestrained need for control, tied to an inflated self-image. He considered himself the vital force in the lives of the people he killed, imagining their transitions as orchestrated by him alone. His confessions painted the clearest possible picture of who he was. He was not simply a man who killed out of desperation or passion. He was not random or opportunistic. He was systematic, self-styled, and obsessed with control. The descriptions he provided revealed a man hungry for significance, imagining that through murder he had carved out immortality. Each word turned the investigation into something more than an inquiry into crime. It was now an exploration of the way one man constructed an identity out of dominance. His people, as he called them, were victims reduced to lines in his distorted story. For investigators, the clarity was painful but also necessary. The confessions confirmed the scope, the mindset, and the utter absence of empathy. They presented not just a killer but a profile of obsession, a man who tethered his existence to the destruction of others and called it life. Those words, preserved in record, remain a window into his mind for both law enforcement and psychologists. His trial brought the final judgment on his fate. The courtroom had to protect society from the defendant inside it. When Alexander Pichushkin went on trial in Moscow in the year 2007, authorities made a decision that would shape how the public remembered him. They placed him in a transparent glass cage at the center of the room, separating him from the families of victims, the press, and even the court staff. It was not just a symbolic measure. Court officials feared that someone might try to attack him, and they also feared that he himself might lash out unpredictably. The glass cage became an image carried across Russian media, a reminder that both his crimes and his persona required extraordinary levels of control. The trial itself drew immense attention. Reporters filled the courtroom, and cameras captured every moment of the proceedings. Russia had dealt with serial killers before, but the scale of Pichushkin's case made it a national spectacle. People who had followed rumors of the Bitsa Park maniac now learned the full scope of his violence. Not only did prosecutors present evidence from dozens of cases, but they also played tapes of his reenactments, where he calmly explained his methods. Every detail placed before the jury reinforced the calculated nature of what had taken place over 14 years. In October of that year, the panel of judges reached their decision. Alexander Pichushkin was convicted of 49 counts of murder and 3 attempted murders. Though he often claimed he had killed far more, the conviction reflected only the cases supported by physical evidence and consistent testimony. This made him one of Russia's most prolific confirmed killers, though even in court, prosecutors acknowledged that the true toll could be higher. The conviction secured his place in Russia's criminal history books, and it left the court with the task of determining how to punish him. Judge Vladimir Usov delivered the sentencing with language that underscored the severity of the crimes. Pichushkin was handed a life sentence, with an initial term of 15 years in solitary confinement. Under Russian law, life imprisonment in solitary stands among the harshest sentences possible. For the first decade and a half, he would be kept completely apart from other inmates, with limited human contact and restricted movements. The measure was designed not just to punish him, but to ensure he could not influence or harm others inside the prison system. Even after that period expired, he would never walk free again. Pichushkin did not accept this outcome quietly. He appealed, claiming that the sentence was too harsh. He asked for it to be reduced to 25 years, a request that reflected how drastically he underestimated the response to his crimes. Russian courts rejected his petition without debate. The rejection confirmed what Judge Usov had established, that the scope of his murders and the cruelty of his methods placed him beyond the reach of leniency. The appeal only highlighted the contrast between his perception of himself and the reality of how the justice system and the public saw him. For the families of those he killed, the sentencing provided little comfort, but some measure of closure. Many attended the courtroom, sitting only feet away from the man who had taken their loved ones. The glass barrier ensured no violence could occur, but it also created a sense of distance, leaving relatives to stare at him like a specimen cut off from the world. Some called the sentence justice, while others felt it could never match the scope of the pain. Their presence, though, demonstrated the collective impact of dozens of lives ended without warning. The public reaction spread across Russia. News broadcasts replayed footage of him sitting calmly in the cage, sometimes smirking, other times silent. People described anger at the thought of how long he had operated without being caught. Fear too lingered, especially for Moscow residents who realized they had lived near a man killing in their parks and neighborhoods. At the same time, a level of fascination grew. Citizens who had no direct connection to the crimes were drawn to the mystery of how someone could carry out such acts. This mix of emotions, anger, fear, and curiosity turned the trial into one of the most watched court cases in recent Russian history. Over time, his case passed from breaking news into cultural memory. Writers published books about him, cataloguing his murders and reflecting on the investigation. Documentaries soon included his story among accounts of other well-known serial killers. Discovery's series Serial Killers chose his crimes as part of their first season, emphasizing how his game-like approach shocked audiences. Podcasts followed, each dissecting the details of Bitzer Park, his hammer, and his chessboard fixation. Shows like My Favorite Murder and That's Why We Drink dedicated entire episodes to his crimes, ensuring that even beyond Russia, his name became part of the international lore of serial murder. The fascination did not stem from sympathy, but from horror. People wanted to understand how an ordinary individual, living in an apartment block, could hide such atrocities. The cage in the courtroom became the lasting image, frozen in photos and video. In the years since, that image has symbolized the gulf between the ordinary neighbor people may pass on the street and the hidden predator capable of destroying dozens of lives. The contrast between mundane appearances and monstrous acts kept his story alive in popular culture. Even after the court handed down its ruling, people debated what made Pichushkin different from others. Some emphasized his childhood injury, others stressed his isolation after his grandfather's death, and some focused on the ritualistic features of his killings. Whatever the cause, his trial stood as the turning point where rumor and speculation gave way to confirmed fact. No longer was he a nameless figure prowling the park. No longer was he a shadow in police reports. He was a convicted murderer, formally recognized as one of the most prolific in Russia. Justice, in his case, carried a particular irony. He had positioned himself as a godlike figure, recalling every detail of his killings as if they were deliberate moves in a match. Yet in court, instead of commanding life or death, he found himself enclosed in glass, restricted, his words no longer a declaration of authority but statements recorded into official records. His ability to command was gone. The cage reduced him to someone observed and controlled, not feared or revered. For him, that isolation was the reversal of every illusion he had created. Although the trial brought justice, it did not erase fascination. Each book, television program, and podcast ensured his name would remain in circulation, discussed not only in Russia, but abroad. For ordinary people, his case became a reminder that killers often hide in the most ordinary settings. Apartment blocks, metro stations, and city parks became linked forever to a man who exploited everyday places to cover deadly habits. Those final images from the courtroom, with him boxed in glass and destined for solitary, continue to serve as the ending chapter for the families and the opening line for those who would study or retell his story. Justice had been served, but fascination with his crimes would continue. Where is he now, nearly 2 decades later? Locked away in Russia's Arctic, Alexander Pichushkin spends his days in freezing solitude. After his conviction in the year 2007, he was sent to one of the most remote and secure prisons in the country, a place known as the Polar Owl Penal Colony. Located deep in the northern regions, far from Moscow and any major settlement, the prison has a reputation for being one of the harshest institutions in Russia's penal system. The cold climate, the endless stretch of tundra, and the walls of steel and concrete make it a place where escape is not even a possibility. It was here the Russian courts decided the chessboard killer would serve the rest of his life. Unlike standard correctional facilities, the Polar Owl is designed for the state's most dangerous inmates. It is not only about serving time, but also ensuring that society is completely cut off from men who have already proved their capacity for violence. Pichushkin's sentence began with 15 years of solitary confinement. That meant a single cell, day after day, with little human interaction and no chance to socialize with other prisoners. For him, who once spent years wandering Moscow's most crowded park hunting strangers, this existence represented the total opposite. Access to conversation, freedom of movement, even a simple sense of companionship, all were stripped away. The sentence reflected both punishment and prevention. In many ways, his isolation is both a safeguard and a statement. After claiming dozens of lives, he has now become invisible to the outside world. The prison restricts his movements and limits contact even within its secured walls. Records about his daily life are scarce, deliberately controlled by Russian authorities. Inmates at Polar Owl live under constant supervision, with routines that leave little room for variation. For nearly 2 decades, Pichushkin has spent this existence in monotony. Each day is measured by the same narrow schedule. Visitors are rare. Communication with the outside is tightly restricted, often intercepted or monitored. Isolation serves as safety for others, but also highlights the eternal finality of his sentence. Information on his health and mental state is almost non-existent. Russian authorities rarely release data about the personal conditions of inmates at high-security facilities, and journalists have little access to this remote place. Sparse reports suggest he remains considered one of the most dangerous prisoners in the country, but concrete details about his current life are minimal. This silence itself is telling. In Bitzer Park, his crimes were visible in every detail of the crime scenes, each body left with a signature of domination. At Polar Owl, nothing leaves the walls. Official silence has turned him from a public predator into a figure consumed entirely by confinement. Even so, his name has not faded. The chessboard killer remains a subject of discussion in crime forums, podcasts, documentaries, and books. People still examine his case, compare his methods to other infamous killers, and speculate on his psychology. He remains a figure of fascination for those trying to understand the patterns of violent offenders. What makes his case stand out is how ordinary his life once appeared, and how extraordinary his crimes became. This continuing interest shows how criminals of his scale slip into a kind of infamy that persists long after capture. However, these conversations happen without him. Locked away in his icebound cell, Pichushkin has no say in the way his story is now told. The contrast is stark. In the early 2000s, when he stalked Moscow's Bitsa Park, he moved among crowds. Families picnicked, dog owners walked, pensioners played chess, and within those ordinary activities he found victims. Thousands of people passed daily through the places he hunted. His crimes occurred in busy urban life, often steps away from unsuspecting citizens. Today, that life of constant interaction is gone. Where once he wandered among people in city parks, he now spends each day locked in Arctic solitude, watched by guards rather than neighbors. The shift from public predator to isolated inmate emphasizes the finality of his conviction. In June of the year 2025, authorities denied his request to transfer to a facility closer to Moscow. He wanted relocation, but officials refused. Staying at the Polar Owl reinforced the reality of his punishment. He would remain in the Arctic, far from family, far from attention, far from the city that for years provided both his hunting ground and his freedom. The refusal confirmed that his case demanded not only confinement but distance. He would not live out his years in central Russia, where attention might surround him. He would instead continue on in silence, in an isolated cell cut off from any environment where recognition could fuel him. Descriptions of the Polar Owl emphasize the unforgiving nature of life there. Winter stretches across most of the year. The prison is built to resist the freezing winds and heavy snow, but the cold never disappears. Inmates have few comforts, and routines are enforced with military precision. For a man once known for wandering vast city forests, the tiny cell is a striking reversal. He cannot choose his path, his victims, or his strategy anymore. Every move is decided by the state, every hour governed by an authority he can no longer resist. He does not carry a chessboard in his cell. Instead, the rigid walls around him are the board now, and he has no pieces left to play. The life he leads today is one without theatre. No cameras record his reenactments. No investigators ask him to recount his methods. No neighbours unknowingly share his hallway. He is one of many prisoners locked out of sight in Russia's far northern reaches. Yet, his case maintains interest outside, where criminologists analyse his moves and storytellers retell his methods. The silence around him only deepens the intrigue. While he wastes days in confinement, the chessboard killer lives on in discussions he cannot hear. This outcome marks one of the sharpest reversals in Russian crime history. Once active in crowded Moscow, Alexander Pichushkin now sits chained to icy isolation. His sentence ensures that his time will end not in another demonstration of control, but in the quiet monotony of a prison cell, thousands of miles away from the city streets where he thrived as a predator. For him, there will be no final move, no chance to claim another square. His game ended long ago, leaving him with nothing but the empty hours of imprisonment. In this way, his story ends not with glory, but locked in silence. His life inside the Polar Owl penal colony shows the finality of justice: extreme isolation, endless cold, and zero possibility of return to the world he once terrorized. His story leaves a troubling reminder about hidden predators.